Hey everyone, welcome back. Tonight, just like always, we're going to slow things down a little. If you're new here, this is a place where you can just relax, unwind, maybe play a game in the background, or even try to fall asleep while listening to some real-life stories pulled from across the internet. Before we get into it, I just want to say I really appreciate you being here. Whether you're watching this while gaming, lying in bed, or just letting it play quietly in the background. Genuinely means a lot, and as always, feel free to leave a comment telling me what you're doing while listening. I read way more of them than you probably think. Alright, let's get into the first story. So this happened about a year ago, and even now I still think about it more often than I probably should. I had just moved into a new apartment complex. Nothing fancy, just a quiet, mid-sized building on the edge of the city. The kind of place where most people keep to themselves. You might exchange a polite nod in the hallway, but that's about it. Which, honestly, is exactly what I wanted. I work remotely, so my days are usually pretty routine. Wake up, coffee, sit down at my desk, headphones on, and just get through work. I don't have a huge social circle, and I kind of like it that way. Peaceful, predictable. The first week after moving in was completely uneventful, until I met him. I was taking out the trash one evening, probably around 8 or 9, and as I stepped into the hallway, I noticed my neighbor's door was slightly open. Not wide open, just enough to see a sliver of darkness inside. I didn't think much of it at first, but as I walked past, I heard a voice. "Hey, you're new here, right?" It caught me off guard. I turned and saw him standing just inside the doorway, barely visible except for his face. He looked normal enough, mid-40s maybe. Slightly unkempt hair, tired eyes, but nothing immediately alarming. "Yeah," I said, "just moved in last week." He nodded slowly, like he was processing something deeper than the conversation required. "I noticed," he said. That was the first moment something felt off. Not scary, not yet, just off. I kind of laughed it off and said something like, "Yeah, still getting settled in." He stepped a little closer to the doorway but didn't fully come out. "You work from home, right?" That stopped me. I hadn't told anyone that. I hadn't even spoken to anyone in the building yet. Yeah," I said. "How did you? You're at your desk most of the day," he interrupted. Corner of the room, facing the window. There was a pause, and in that pause my brain started trying to catch up, because he was right. That was exactly where my desk was, and I hadn't closed my blinds much during the day. I felt this weird mix of confusion and discomfort settle in my chest. "Yeah," I said slowly. "I guess you can see through the window from outside." He smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that lingers just a second too long. "Sometimes," he said. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded, gave a quick, "Well, nice meeting you," and kept walking toward the trash room. But the whole time I could feel it, that feeling that someone was watching you, even when you're not looking. And when I came back down the hallway a minute later, his door was closed, completely closed, like no one had been there at all. That night I shut my blinds for the first time since moving in. I remember standing there in my living room, pulling them closed and feeling vaguely ridiculous about it, like I was overreacting to one slightly weird interaction with a socially awkward neighbor. That's what I told myself anyway, because on paper, nothing that dramatic had happened. A guy had noticed I was new. He'd made a weird comment about me working from home. Maybe he had seen me through the window a couple of times. Maybe he was just nosy. Apartment buildings are full of people who know too much about each other without ever properly meeting. Still, I kept thinking about the way he said it. I noticed, not I guessed, not I happened to see. I noticed. There was something so deliberate about that wording that it got under my skin. The next morning, I opened the blinds just enough to let some light in, but not enough for anyone outside to get a clear view. Then I made coffee, sat at my desk, and tried to get on with work. For most of the morning, I forgot about it. Emails, meetings, spreadsheets, the usual boring stuff. Then around 11:30, I got up to refill my mug and happened to glance toward the window. And there he was, not outside. Not standing in some obvious place staring up like a cartoon villain. Just across the courtyard, on the second-floor walkway of the opposite building, leaning casually against the railing, looking directly at my window. It was one of those moments where your brain doesn't want to accept what your eyes are seeing. Because technically, maybe he wasn't looking at me. Maybe he was just standing there. Maybe he was thinking about something else entirely. But the second I noticed him, he lifted one hand in a small wave, then he walked away. I stood there frozen, coffee mug in hand, feeling this prickling sensation move up the back of my neck. That was when discomfort started becoming actual anxiety. I spent the rest of the day hyper-aware of every little sound outside, every footstep in the hallway, every time the building creaked, every shadow moving past the narrow opening in my blinds. By evening, I'd convinced myself again that I was being dramatic, until there was a knock at my door. 3 slow knocks, not aggressive, not loud, just measured, patient. I checked the peephole. It was him. He was standing there with one hand in his pocket and the other holding a plate. I didn't open the door. For maybe 10 seconds, I just stood there silently, hoping he'd assume I wasn't home. Then he spoke through the door. "Hey, I made too much lasagna." I didn't answer. He knocked again, lighter this time. "I know you're in there. I heard your floorboards." That made my stomach drop, not because it was impossible to know someone was home, but because it meant he was paying attention to little details. the kind of details most people don't clock unless they're listening for them. I forced myself to respond, mostly because I didn't want him lingering outside my door. "Sorry," I said, keeping my voice flat. "I'm in the middle of something." There was a pause. Then he said, "You work too much." I felt my grip tighten on the doorknob even though I had no intention of opening it. "Thanks," I said, "but I'm good." Another pause, then finally, "All right." I waited by the door for a full minute after I heard his footsteps fade. When I checked the peephole again, the hallway was empty, but the plate was sitting on the floor outside my apartment. I left it there for almost an hour. Eventually, I opened the door just enough to pull it inside with one hand. It was covered in foil, warm, smelled normal, probably actually was lasagna. I threw the whole thing in the trash, and before anyone says that was rude, I know it sounds rude. But by that point, my instincts were screaming at me that accepting anything from this guy was a bad idea. The next few days got stranger, not in a big, obvious movie-style way, in little ways, subtle ways. The kind of thing that makes you question whether there's actually a pattern or whether your brain is creating one because you're already on edge. For example, I'd leave for the grocery store and find him in the hallway almost every single time. Come back from checking the mail, and his door would click shut just as I reached my apartment. Twice, I opened my front door in the morning and found small things placed neatly on the doormat. Once it was a packet of herbal tea. Another time it was one of those miniature hand sanitizers. No note, no explanation, just objects. I never saw him leave them there. And I know some people are going to hear that and think maybe he was just awkwardly trying to be nice. But there's a difference between friendly and invasive. Friendly says, "Hey, I baked too many cookies." Invasive says, "I know your routines, I know when you're home. I know when to place things outside your door without being seen." One afternoon, I mentioned it to my friend Lena over the phone. She asked me the obvious question, "Have you talked to building management?" And I remember hesitating because what exactly was I going to say? My neighbor is weird, he looks at my window, he leaves me tea. None of that sounds serious enough when you say it out loud, not compared to how it feels living inside it. So I said no. And Lena told me something that, looking back, I really should have acted on sooner. She said, "Start documenting everything." At the time it felt dramatic. By the end of that week it felt necessary. So I started a note on my phone, nothing elaborate, just dates, times, and whatever happened. Tuesday 7:42 p.m. found tea packet outside door. Wednesday 11:31 a.m. saw him across courtyard watching my window. Thursday 6:05 p.m. heard his door open when I got home, then close again. Friday 8:14 a.m. sanitizer left on doormat. Seeing it written out like that did two things at once. First, it made me feel less crazy. The pattern was real. Things were happening often enough that it wasn't just my imagination stitching unrelated moments together. But second, it made me realize how much of my attention this guy had already taken over. I was thinking about him constantly. When I left my apartment, I listened for hallway sounds before opening the door. When I got home, I'd unlock the deadbolt quickly and step inside like I was trying to beat something invisible. Even during work, I found myself glancing at the window every 20 minutes. That's the thing about this kind of situation. It doesn't have to become openly dangerous to start controlling your life. Sometimes the uncertainty is enough. About 4 days after I started documenting everything, I had my first genuinely alarming moment. It was late, maybe 12:20 at night. I'd stayed up too long watching random videos, and I was in the kitchen pouring a glass of water when I heard a sound outside my apartment. Not footsteps exactly, more like a faint scrape, like something gently brushing against the door. I froze and waited. Then I heard it again. Scrape, slow, deliberate. I set the glass down as quietly as I could and walked toward the door without turning on any extra lights. I didn't make a sound. I don't know why. Instinct, I guess. That animal part of your brain that decides silence is safer. I leaned toward the peephole and looked out. At first I didn't see anyone. The hallway was dim, lit only by those awful apartment bulbs that make everything look slightly yellow and sick. Then I noticed movement low to the ground. He was crouched beside my door, not kneeling to pick something up, not tying a shoe, just crouched there, one hand near the frame, his head tilted slightly like he was listening. My entire body went cold. I remember pulling back from the peephole so fast I almost stumbled. For a second I just stood there, heart pounding, trying to decide what to do. Call out? No. Open the door? Absolutely not. Call the police? That felt huge, and in the stupidest possible way, part of me still worried that I'd somehow be overreacting. Then before I could decide, I heard him stand up. A few seconds later, footsteps moved quietly down the hall. I waited a full 2 minutes before looking again. Empty hallway. I did not sleep much that night. The next morning I checked outside. There was nothing on the doormat, nothing taped to the frame. No sign he'd been there at all. Except right near the bottom edge of the door, tucked into the corner where the frame met the wall, there was a thin strip of clear plastic. Almost like part of a broken packaging tab. It looked meaningless, tiny, easy to miss, but it hadn't been there before. And suddenly I had this horrible suspicion about why he'd been crouched there. I'd heard of people doing little tests like that, placing something near a door or across a threshold so they could tell later whether someone had gone in or out. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe it was trash that had drifted there, but maybe I wasn't wrong, and that possibility was enough. I took a picture of it, threw it away, and finally emailed building management. I kept the message careful and restrained because I wanted to sound credible. I said I'd had several uncomfortable interactions with the tenant in the neighboring unit, that he had been monitoring my schedule, leaving items outside my door, and that I believed he had been lingering near my apartment late at night. The response came 6 hours later. It was one of those polite, useless messages that reads like someone's trying to resolve the issue while also doing absolutely nothing. They said they were sorry to hear I felt uncomfortable. They said neighbor disputes can sometimes stem from misunderstandings. They said if I felt unsafe in an immediate situation, I should contact local authorities. No mention of speaking to him. No mention of checking cameras. No mention of taking it seriously. Just corporate fog. That response made me angrier than I expected, because once again, the whole thing sounded too small when turned into formal language. He's making me uncomfortable. I think he watches me. Something feels wrong. Those are hard things to prove when nothing dramatic has happened yet. Later that same day, I ran into an older woman from the 3rd floor while checking my mail. We exchanged smiles a couple times before, but never really talked. She noticed I seemed tense and asked if I was okay. I almost gave the automatic, yeah, just tired, but then I stopped myself. And I said, can I ask you something weird? The guy in 2B, do you know him at all? Her expression changed immediately. Not panic, not shock, recognition. The kind that told me I was not the first person to ask. She lowered her voice and said, you live next to Aaron, right? That was the first time I heard his name. I said yes. She hesitated for a second and then said, he's intense. I remember actually laughing once just from pure nerves. Intense felt like such an inadequate word for what I'd been experiencing. She glanced around the mailroom before continuing. He used to try talking to me a lot when I first moved in. He notices things, too many things. I started avoiding him. My stomach tightened. I asked her if he'd ever done anything specific, and she said something that stuck with me. No single thing, that's what makes it hard. It's always just enough to make you uneasy, never enough to make a report sound solid. Exactly, that was exactly it. She told me she'd heard at least one other tenant complain informally about him a year earlier, but as far as she knew, nothing had come of it. Then she said very quietly, keep your blinds shut at night. I asked why, and she just shook her head. I used to see him standing in the courtyard sometimes, looking up. That was the moment this stopped being a weird personal tension and started feeling like a pattern. A real one, not in my head, not accidental. A pattern. I went back upstairs with my mail and locked the door behind me. Then I did something I should have done much earlier. I ordered a camera, 2 of them actually. One for inside facing the front door, and one small one that could sit near the window. At that point, I still didn't fully know what I was expecting to catch, but I knew one thing for certain. Whatever this was, I was done relying on gut feelings alone. The cameras arrived 2 days later. And those were probably the longest 2 days of the entire situation, because once I'd made the decision to take it seriously, I couldn't go back to pretending it was nothing. Every sound felt louder, every small detail felt loaded. Even normal things like someone walking past my door or a pipe creaking in the wall started setting off that low-level alarm in the back of my mind. I kept my blinds fully closed now, not halfway, not angled, completely shut. The apartment felt darker because of it, but I didn't care. I'd rather deal with less sunlight than feel like I was being watched every time I sat down at my desk. When the cameras finally showed up, I set them up immediately. The first one went on a shelf across from the front door, angled so it could capture anyone approaching or standing outside. It also had motion detection, which meant I'd get alerts on my phone. The second one I placed near the window, pointing outward through a narrow gap in the blinds. I tested both, checked the angles, made sure the recordings were saving properly. For the first time in over a week, I felt not safe exactly, but a little more in control. That feeling lasted about 12 hours. The first alert came at 2:17 a.m. I was asleep, or at least I had been. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, and I woke up just enough to see the notification. Motion detected, front door camera. At first, I didn't fully process it. I just stared at the screen, still half asleep, trying to make sense of what I was looking at. Then it hit me, and suddenly I was wide awake. I opened the app. The live feed showed the hallway outside my apartment. Empty. For a second, I thought maybe it was a false trigger, a glitch, a shadow. Then I checked the recorded clip. It was only about 10 seconds long, and at first glance it looked like nothing, just the hallway, still, quiet. But then near the end of the clip, movement. The edge of a hand, slowly entering the frame from the side. Not reaching for the door, not knocking, just appearing, fingers first, then part of a wrist. It hovered there for a second, barely moving, and then it withdrew. The clip ended. I remember sitting up in bed, staring at the screen, feeling that same cold sensation spread through my chest again. Because that wasn't someone casually walking by, that was someone standing just out of view. Deliberately testing how far they could move into frame without fully revealing themselves. And I knew exactly who it was. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I checked the footage again, slower this time. Frame by frame, there was no face, no full body, just that hand, but something about it made it worse, because it meant he was aware enough to avoid the camera. which meant he either saw me install it or he was paying close enough attention to notice changes around my door. Either option was bad. That afternoon I got another alert. This time I was awake, sitting at my desk trying to work. My phone buzzed again. Motion detected window camera. I froze for a second before opening the app. The live feed showed the courtyard. Empty, but the recording told a different story. He had been there, standing in roughly the same spot as before across the courtyard, facing my building, looking at my window. The clip showed him for about 5 seconds before he stepped back and disappeared out of frame. But here's the part that made my stomach drop. The timing. The notification had come in less than 10 seconds after I had shifted in my chair. Not stood up, not made a loud noise, just adjusted slightly. Which meant one of two things. Either it was a coincidence, or he had been watching long enough to notice even the smallest movements. That was the moment the situation crossed a line for me. Before it had been unsettling, now it felt intentional, focused, targeted. That evening I finally called the non-emergency police line. I didn't want to sound dramatic, I didn't want to exaggerate, so I just explained exactly what had happened. The neighbor, the repeated encounters, the items left outside my door, the camera footage, the hand, the watching. The person on the phone listened politely, asked a few questions, and then said something I had already started to expect. He made any direct threats? No. Has he attempted to enter your apartment? No. Has he physically confronted you? No. There was a pause then. At this time there's not much we can do unless the behavior escalates or becomes explicitly threatening. There it was again, that same wall. Nothing had happened enough, not enough to act, not enough to intervene, just enough to make me feel like I was constantly being observed. I thanked them, hung up, and sat there in silence for a while. Because now I understood something very clearly. Whatever this situation was, I was going to have to deal with it myself, or wait until it became something worse, and I didn't like either of those options. That night I moved a chair in front of my door before going to bed, not because it would stop anyone, but because it made me feel like I was doing something, anything. At around 3 a.m. my phone buzzed again. Another motion alert. I didn't even open the app right away. I just sat there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, already knowing what I was going to see. After about 10 seconds I picked up my phone and pressed play. This time it wasn't just a hand. It was him, standing directly in front of my door, looking straight at it, not knocking, not moving, just standing there, completely still, for the entire duration of the clip, and right before it ended, he leaned forward slightly, close enough that the camera picked up part of his face. And even through the grainy night vision I could see it. He was smiling. I didn't open the door. That probably sounds obvious, but in that moment there was this strange split in my mind. One part of me was purely instinct, stay still, stay quiet, don't engage. The other part wanted to understand why he was there, what he thought he was doing, what would happen if I actually confronted him, but instinct won. I stayed in bed, staring at the ceiling, phone in my hand, watching the clip over and over again like somehow it would make more sense the 10th time. It didn't. He had just stood there, smiling, not knocking, not speaking, just present. After the clip ended, I switched to the live feed. Empty hallway, of course. He was gone again like he always was, appearing just long enough to leave that feeling behind, then disappearing before anything concrete could happen. I didn't sleep at all that night. At around 6 a.m., I gave up trying and just sat at my desk with the lights on, waiting for daylight like that would somehow make things feel normal again. It didn't, because now I had proof. Before, everything had been subtle, easy to second guess, easy to explain away. Now I had a recording of him standing outside my door in the middle of the night, staring at it, smiling. That morning I emailed building management again. This time I attached screenshots, clear ones, him outside my door. The timestamp, the hallway, I didn't try to soften it or make it sound reasonable. I just wrote, "This is not a misunderstanding. This is ongoing behavior and it's escalating." Their response came faster this time, still polite, still careful, but slightly more serious. They said they would look into it and reach out to the tenant in question. Which sounded good on paper, but didn't actually make me feel any safer, because if they talked to him, he would know I reported him. And I had no idea how he would react to that. The rest of that day passed slowly. I barely got any work done. Every time my phone buzzed, I checked it immediately. Every small sound in the hallway made my attention snap toward the door. Around 3 p.m. there was a knock, not slow this time, not patient, just 2 quick knocks. I froze. Then I checked the camera. It wasn't him. It was a maintenance guy. I opened the door just enough to talk. He said management had asked him to check the locks and make sure everything was functioning properly. I let him in. He inspected the deadbolt, the handle, the frame. Everything was fine. Before he left, I asked him casually, like it wasn't a big deal, if he'd ever had complaints about the guy in 2B. He hesitated. Not long, but enough. Then he said, "I don't get involved in tenant stuff." Which technically wasn't an answer, but it also kind of was. After he left, I locked the door again and just stood there for a minute, because the pattern was becoming clearer. People knew, not in a formal, documented way, but in that quiet, unspoken way where everyone has just enough information to feel uneasy but not enough to act. That evening I made a decision. I wasn't going to wait for something worse to happen. I started looking at other apartments, nothing fancy, just somewhere else, somewhere without him. I didn't tell anyone, not yet. I just opened a few tabs and started browsing listings. Because even if nothing officially happened, I didn't want to live like this. Always listening, always checking, always wondering if someone was just outside my door. Around 8 p.m. my phone buzzed again. Motion alert, front door. I didn't feel that same spike of panic this time, more like a heavy, tired dread. I opened the app. He was there again, but this time he wasn't just standing, he was holding something. A small piece of paper. He bent down and placed it carefully on my doormat. Then he stood up and looked directly into the camera. No attempt to hide this time, no staying out of frame, just a long, steady look, like he wanted me to know that he knew. Then he turned and walked back to his apartment. I waited a full minute before opening the door. The hallway was empty. The paper was still there. I picked it up slowly. It was folded once. Inside, there was a single sentence. "You don't have to be afraid if you just talk to me." I stood there reading it over and over again, because on the surface, it sounds almost reasonable, like someone trying to fix a misunderstanding, but in context, it felt like something else entirely. Because I had never given him any reason to think I shouldn't feel safe. He had created that feeling himself, and now he was framing it like it was my responsibility to resolve it. I closed the door, locked it, and slid the note onto my desk. Then I did something I hadn't done yet. I called my friend Lena again, and this time I didn't downplay anything. I told her everything. The hallway. The cameras, the footage, the note, the smile. There was a long pause after I finished. Then she said very clearly, "Yeah, you need to leave. Not be careful, not talk to management again. Just leave." And for the first time since this started, that felt like the only answer that actually made sense. That night I didn't even pretend to relax. I left the lights on in the living room, kept my phone fully charged, and moved a few things around so I could leave quickly if I needed to. Not in a dramatic, packed bags by the doorway, just small adjustments. Shoes near the entrance, wallet and keys in the same place. Laptop already in my backpack. It's strange how quickly your brain shifts into that kind of quiet preparation mode, like it knows something you don't want to fully admit yet. I also responded to a couple of apartment listings. Nothing fancy, just quick messages asking about availability, lease terms, move-in dates. I didn't even care about the price at that point. I just wanted out. Around 11 p.m. I finally turned off the main lights and went into the bedroom. Not to sleep really, just to lie down. I left the camera app open on my phone. Front door feed, volume up. I must have dozed off at some point because the next thing I remember is waking up to a sound. Not the phone, not a notification. A real sound, a faint click. I sat up instantly. Every part of me went alert at the same time. There was silence for a second. Then a soft, almost inaudible pressure against the door. Not a knock, not a push, just pressure, like someone testing it. I grabbed my phone and opened the camera feed. He was there again, standing close to the door, closer than before, one hand resting flat against it. Not moving, just feeling it. That's the only way I can describe it. Feeling the door, I didn't breathe, I didn't move, I just watched. After a few seconds, he leaned forward slightly, and then he spoke, not loud. Not even normal volume, just enough that the microphone picked it up faintly. "I know you're awake." My entire body locked up. I hadn't made a sound, the lights were off. There was no way he should have known that, unless I stopped that thought immediately, because I didn't want to go down that path. He stayed there for maybe another 10 seconds, hand still on the door. Then slowly he removed it, stepped back, and walked away. I stayed frozen for at least a full minute after he disappeared from the frame. Then I got up, not carefully, not quietly. I just moved straight to the door, checked the locks, both engaged, deadbolt secure, chain in place. Then I stepped back and just stood there, trying to process what had just happened, because that crossed a line. Before, everything had been outside the boundary. The hallway, the window, the doormat. Now he had touched the door. He had spoken to me through it. He had said he knew I was awake. That wasn't vague anymore. That wasn't ambiguous. That was direct, and it changed everything. I didn't go back to bed. I stayed up the rest of the night, sitting on the couch with the lights on, the camera feed open, and my phone in my hand. At around 7 a.m. I made another decision. I wasn't staying another night. I didn't care about lease terms. I didn't care about notice periods. I didn't care about logistics. I just needed to not be there anymore. I called in sick to work. Then I called the first apartment listing that had responded. They had a unit available immediately. Short-term lease. Higher rent than I wanted. Didn't matter. I said yes. They told me I could come sign paperwork that afternoon. Perfect. I started packing right away. Not everything, just essentials. Clothes, laptop, documents, a few personal things. The rest I'd deal with later. Every time I moved through the apartment, I felt like I was on a timer. Like at any moment there would be another knock. Another presence outside the door. Around 10:30 a.m. there was one final moment that sealed it. Another motion alert. Front door. I checked the feed. He was there again, but this time he wasn't looking at the door. He was looking directly into the camera, and he wasn't smiling anymore. His expression was flat, empty. He stood there for a few seconds, then he raised his hand and slowly knocked 3 times, not loud, not aggressive, just intentional. I didn't respond. I didn't move. I just watched him through the screen. After a few seconds, he leaned slightly closer to the door and said quietly, "You're leaving," not a question, a statement. Then he turned and walked away, and that was it. That was the moment I stopped feeling unsure, stopped questioning, stopped wondering if I was overreacting, because somehow he already knew. After he said that, "You're leaving," I didn't hesitate anymore, whatever doubt I had left gone. Because there are only so many coincidences you can stack before they stop being coincidences. I hadn't told anyone in the building. I hadn't spoken to management about moving. I hadn't even finalized anything yet, and somehow he knew, or at least he was confident enough to say it like he did. That calm certainty, that's what stuck with me, not anger, not frustration. Certainty. I packed faster after that. No more pauses, no more overthinking what to take, just the essentials. Clothes, laptop, documents, chargers, anything that would be a pain to replace. Everything else could wait. Around noon, I called Lena again and asked if she could come over. I didn't want to be there alone anymore. She didn't even ask questions this time. She just said, "I'm on my way." Those 20 minutes waiting for her were probably the longest of the entire situation. Not because anything happened, but because of the anticipation. Every small sound felt like it could be him. Every shadow under the door made me look up. Every second stretched. When Lena finally knocked, I checked the camera first, made sure it was actually her. Then I opened the door, and the second she stepped inside, something shifted. Not safety exactly, but less exposed. I explained everything again, this time showing her the footage. The hand, him standing outside, the smile, the note, the moment at the door. She watched all of it without interrupting, and when it was over, she just said, "Yeah. We're not staying here. Not you, we," and that made a bigger difference than I expected. We finished packing together, faster now, more focused. At one point, Lena asked if I'd seen him at all that morning besides the camera. I said no, and that was technically true, but it didn't feel like the full truth, because even when he wasn't visible, it still felt like he was there. Around 1:30 p.m. we were ready to leave. I took one last look around the apartment, half empty now. Quiet, normal if you ignored everything that had happened inside it. Then I grabbed my bag, checked the door one more time and opened it. The hallway was empty. We stepped out. I locked the door behind me, and for the first time in days I felt something close to relief. Not full relief, but movement. Forward. We made it halfway down the hallway before it happened. His door opened, not suddenly, not dramatically, just slowly, like he had been standing there already, waiting. He stepped out just enough to see us, and we both stopped because there he was, in the hallway, in real life. Not through a camera, not through a peephole, just there. For a second, nobody said anything. Then he looked at me, then at Lena, then back at me, and he smiled again. But this time it wasn't the same smile. Before it had been unsettling. Now it felt resigned, like he already knew how this was going to go. "You didn't have to do all this," he said. His voice was calm, almost disappointed. I didn't respond. Lena didn't either. We just stood there. He took a small step forward, not aggressive, not fast, just enough to make the space feel smaller. "I was just trying to get to know you," he continued, and I remember thinking how absurd that sounded. After everything, after the watching, the notes, the door, the camera. "That's not how you do that," Lena said. Her voice was steady, controlled. He looked at her like he hadn't fully registered her presence until that moment. Then he tilted his head slightly. "I wasn't talking to you." That was the first moment I felt actual anger cut through the fear. Not panic, not anxiety, just anger, because of how casually he dismissed her, like she didn't matter, like this was still some kind of one-on-one interaction he controlled. I stepped slightly forward, not toward him, just enough to make it clear I wasn't backing away. "You need to stay away from me," I said. My voice didn't shake, which surprised me. For a second he just looked at me, then he nodded, slowly, like he was acknowledging something obvious. "I have," he said. That almost made me laugh because it was so detached from reality. He gestured lightly toward my door. I never crossed the line. That phrase. The line. Like there had been some invisible boundary he had carefully respected. Even though everything about his behavior had been built around getting as close to that boundary as possible without stepping over it. That was the moment I understood something. This wasn't accidental. This wasn't awkwardness. This wasn't social incompetence. This was deliberate, calculated. He knew exactly what he was doing, and exactly how far he could go without triggering a real consequence. I didn't argue. There was no point. Instead, I just said, "I'm leaving." He studied my face for a second, then nodded again. "Yeah," he said quietly, "I know." And that was it. No apology, no explanation, no attempt to stop us. He just stepped back into his apartment and slowly closed the door. We didn't wait, we didn't say anything else. We just walked down the hallway, into the elevator, out of the building, and into the parking lot. And only when we got into the car and the doors locked did I finally feel like I could breathe again. The drive to the new place felt quiet, not peaceful, just quiet in that strange way where your brain is still catching up to everything that just happened. Lena was driving. I was in the passenger seat, staring out the window, watching the city pass by like it didn't have anything to do with me, because part of me still felt like I hadn't fully left yet, like I was still back there, in that apartment, in that hallway, standing in front of that door. We didn't talk much during the drive. Not because there was nothing to say, but because there was too much, and neither of us really knew where to start. When we got to the new place, everything moved quickly. Paperwork, keys, quick walkthrough. It wasn't perfect. Smaller than my old apartment. Slightly louder area, but it didn't matter, because the one thing it didn't have was him. We unloaded my stuff, got everything inside and closed the door. And when that door shut, it felt different, not just physically, mentally. Like something had finally ended. Lena stayed for a while, helped me set a few things up, made sure I was okay. Before she left, she said something that stuck with me. If anything even remotely weird happens here, you tell someone immediately. No waiting. I nodded, because now I understood that part. Waiting doesn't help. Doubt doesn't help. Minimizing things doesn't help. If something feels wrong, it probably is. After she left, I sat on the couch in my new apartment and just existed for a while. No tension, no listening for footsteps, no checking cameras, just quiet. For the first time in days, I felt tired in a normal way. Not that wired, anxious exhaustion, just tired. I slept that night, actually slept. No interruptions, no alerts, no sudden wake-ups, just sleep. The next morning, everything felt a little more distant, still real, still unsettling, but less immediate, like it had moved from something happening to something that had happened. Over the next few days, I went back to the old apartment once with Lena to grab the rest of my things. We went during the middle of the day, in and out as quickly as possible. I didn't see him. His door stayed closed the entire time. No sounds, no movement, nothing, and honestly, that almost felt worse, because it meant he could be there, right on the other side, aware, listening, just choosing not to show it. After that, I never went back. I finished the lease situation remotely, paid whatever fees I had to, and just closed that chapter. But here's the part that still sticks with me. Even now, weeks later, months later, sometimes I still think about what he said. I never crossed the line. Because in a technical sense, he was right. He never broke in, never threatened me directly, never touched me, never did anything that would immediately trigger action from management or police. But that's exactly what made it so unsettling. He lived right up against that boundary, constantly, deliberately, close enough to control the situation, close enough to create fear, but never far enough to face consequences. And that's something I didn't really understand before this. How someone can affect your life so much without ever doing something that sounds serious when you explain it out loud. He stood outside my door. He watched my window. He left things on my doormat. Individually, those things don't sound like emergencies. But together, over time, they build into something else entirely, something heavy, something that stays with you. I still double-check my locks at night. I still close my blinds a little more carefully than I used to. And sometimes, when I hear footsteps in the hallway outside my new apartment, I catch myself holding my breath for just a second. Waiting, just to make sure. Nothing happens, of course. It's always nothing. But that instinct, that pause, that's the part that didn't leave. And honestly, I don't think it ever fully will. All right, that one was a bit heavier than usual. The kind of story where nothing officially happens, but somehow it still leaves you more unsettled than the obvious stuff. Let's slow things down a little before the next one. Take a second, relax your shoulders, unclench your jaw, maybe adjust your setup if you're lying down. And whenever you're ready, let's get into the next story. All right, this next story is a little different. It's not about something obviously creepy or dangerous. It's quieter than that, but in a way, it might be even more uncomfortable. Because it's about realizing that someone you trust is slowly taking your place in your own life. So this started about 2 years ago. I had a pretty tight friend group. Nothing huge, maybe 5 or 6 of us who would hang out regularly, grab food, play games, just normal stuff. We weren't the kind of group that did everything together, but there was a core consistency there. Group chats, inside jokes, shared routines, and in the middle of that group there was my best friend Jason. We'd known each other since college, lived together for a year at one point. We had that kind of friendship where you don't really question it, it just exists. Solid, reliable, or at least that's what I thought. About a year ago, Jason started bringing around a new guy. Let's call him Mark. At first it was completely normal. People meet new friends, they introduce them to the group. No big deal. Mark seemed fine. Friendly, easy to talk to, kind of funny in a low-key way. The kind of person who doesn't dominate conversations but slides into them naturally. No red flags. If anything, he was likable, and that's important, because if he hadn't been likable, none of this would have worked. The first few times we hung out, I didn't think twice about it. He came to a couple group dinners, joined a game night, laughed at the same dumb jokes we always made. Fit right in. Looking back, that was probably the first step. Not standing out, not making a big impression. Just blending, becoming part of the background. After maybe a month, Mark started showing up more often. Not just when Jason invited him, just showing up. Group chat messages like, "Hey, you guys still meeting up tonight?" Or, "I might swing by if that's cool." Again, normal. That's how people become part of a group. No one questioned it, least of all me. In fact, I remember thinking it was kind of nice that Jason had found someone new to hang out with. At that point, nothing felt off, not even slightly. If anything, things felt fuller. More people, more energy, more conversation. But then small things started shifting. And the weird part is I didn't notice it right away. Not consciously, it was more like a feeling. Like something in the dynamic had changed, but I couldn't point to exactly what. The first clear moment came during a game night. We were all at my apartment, Same setup as always, snacks on the table, random music playing in the background, everyone kind of half focused on whatever we were doing. At some point I made a joke, one of those dumb inside jokes that usually lands every time. Except this time it didn't. There was a small pause, not awkward, just off. And then Mark said something, not even a better joke, just a variation of mine, slightly reworded, slightly sharper, and suddenly everyone laughed, louder than usual, Jason included. I remember smiling along, but feeling this weird flicker of confusion, because it wasn't about the joke. It was about the timing, the way the energy shifted, like what I said had been ignored, but when he said something similar it landed. Again, not a big deal. On its own that means nothing, but that was the first moment I noticed something was different. After that I started picking up on more little things, subtle ones, like how Mark would remember details about people, not in an obvious way. He wouldn't say, "Oh yeah, you told me that." He'd just casually bring it up later, like, "Didn't you say you had that interview this week?" Or "How did that thing with your boss turn out?" Small stuff, but consistent, and people responded to that. They liked it. It made him seem attentive, thoughtful, which, to be fair, he was, but it also meant that conversations started drifting toward him, not intentionally, just naturally, and again, none of this felt like a problem, not yet. It just felt like the group was evolving, growing, which is normal, that's what I kept telling myself, but then something happened that made me stop and really think about it. One night, Jason and I were supposed to grab food, just the two of us, something we used to do pretty regularly. Nothing planned, just a casual "hey, you free" kind of thing. I got to the restaurant first, waited about 10 minutes, then he texted, "Hey, is it cool if Mark joins?" I stared at the message for a second, and I don't know why, but something about it bothered me more than it should have. It wasn't a big ask, it wasn't unreasonable, but it felt like this wasn't just a random addition. It felt expected, like the default had shifted. I typed back, "Yeah, sure," because what else was I going to say? "No, don't bring your friend," that would have sounded ridiculous, so I agreed. Mark showed up about 5 minutes after Jason. We ordered food, talked, laughed. Everything was fine, but the entire time I had this strange feeling, like I wasn't part of a one-on-one conversation anymore, like I had been folded into something else, and I couldn't quite explain why that bothered me as much as it did. At the end of the night, when we were leaving, Jason said something that stuck with me. He said, "We should do this more often." And I remember thinking we used to, but I didn't say that. I just nodded, and we all went our separate ways. That was the first time I realized something important. Not something dramatic, not something obvious, just a small shift in perspective. I wasn't sure if I was imagining it, but it felt like I wasn't at the center of my own friendships anymore, and I didn't know when that started happening. After that dinner I started paying more attention, not in an obsessive way, just noticing things I probably would have ignored before, and once you start noticing, it's hard to stop. The group chat was the first place it showed up clearly. We had one main chat where everyone talked daily, memes, plans, random thoughts, all that. Before Mark showed up, it had a certain rhythm. People would reply to each other directly. Conversations overlapped. It was messy but familiar. After a while, that rhythm changed, and the weird part is no one announced it, it just shifted. Mark became the person people responded to, not exclusively, but consistently. If I said something, it might get a reaction. If Mark said something, it would almost always get a response, sometimes multiple. At first, I told myself I was overthinking it. Maybe he was just more engaging. Maybe I was quieter lately. Maybe it was nothing, but then I noticed something else. Timing. There were moments where I'd say something, a joke, a thought, whatever, and it would kind of sit there. Not ignored, just not picked up. Then Mark would say something a minute later. Suddenly the chat would come alive again. Same people, same conversation, different center. And once you see that pattern a few times, it's hard not to feel it. Again, none of this was dramatic. No one was excluding me. No one was being rude. But there's a difference between being included and being central, and I could feel myself slowly moving from one to the other. Around that time, Jason started hanging out with Mark more one-on-one. I didn't find that out directly. I just noticed it, little references in conversation. "Oh yeah, Mark and I tried that place last week. We were talking about that the other day," stuff like that. At first, I didn't think much of it. People have multiple friendships, that's normal. But then I realized something. Jason and I hadn't hung out one-on-one in weeks, not because we stopped being friends, not because anything happened, it just stopped occurring, and I hadn't even noticed when it changed. That's the part that got to me. There wasn't a moment where something broke. No argument, no fallout, just a slow replacement of time. And time is what builds closeness, so if that shifts, everything else shifts with it. One night I decided to test something, nothing manipulative, just an observation. The group was planning to hang out that weekend, nothing specific yet, just throwing ideas around. Usually I'd be one of the people pushing plans forward, suggesting places, locking in times. This time I stayed quiet. I wanted to see what would happen if I didn't take that role. For about 10 minutes the conversation drifted, people throwing out vague ideas, nothing sticking, then Mark stepped in. Why don't we just do game night again? Saturday, simple, clear, easy, and instantly everyone agreed. Plans locked, time set, done. I stared at the screen for a second, because that had always been me, not intentionally, just by habit. I was the one who usually solidified things, and now that role had been filled, without anyone saying anything about it, without anyone even noticing, including me until that moment. Saturday came, we all met up at someone else's place this time, not mine, which again shouldn't have mattered, but it did, because my apartment used to be the default spot. Convenient location, good setup, whatever. Now it was, and the energy felt different, not bad, just different. Mark moved through the room like he'd always been part of it, comfortable. Familiar. At one point he got up and grabbed drinks for people. Not in a look at me being helpful way, just casually, like he knew where everything was, like he belonged there, and people responded to that. Thanks man, appreciate it. Small things, but they add up. Later in the night we were all sitting around, talking about random stuff. At some point, someone asked about a trip we had taken last year, one of those group memories that usually turns into a long story. I started telling it, not even thinking about it, just picking up where the memory lived, but about halfway through Mark jumped in. Wait, wasn't that the time when you guys got stuck in the rain for like 2 hours? He looked at Jason when he said it, not at me. Jason laughed. Yeah, that was brutal. And just like that the story shifted. It became their conversation, their version, their memory, even though I had been there, even though I had started telling it. I sat there listening to them talk about something I was part of, and felt like I was hearing it from the outside. That was the moment it really hit, not as a thought, as a feeling. That quiet, uncomfortable realization that I was still in the group, still included, still invited, but somehow I wasn't as essential as I used to be, and I didn't know how to fix that, or if there even was something to fix. After that night, I couldn't really unsee it anymore. Before, everything had been subtle enough that I could brush it off. Now, it felt obvious, not to anyone else, but to me, and that's the frustrating part about situations like this, when something changes in a way that only you seem to notice. Because if you bring it up, you sound insecure. If you stay quiet, it keeps happening. So I stayed quiet, at least at first. Over the next couple of weeks I started pulling back a little, not dramatically. I still showed up to things. Still replied in the group chat, still joked around, but I stopped initiating, stopped being the one to suggest plans, stopped being the one to keep conversations going. Part of it was intentional, part of it just happened naturally. Because when you feel like you're not really needed in a space anymore, you start occupying less space. And again, no one said anything. No one asked, hey, why are you quieter lately? No one noticed the shift, or if they did, they didn't mention it. Meanwhile, Mark kept doing what he'd been doing. Showing up, engaging, remembering things, being present, and that's the thing, he wasn't doing anything wrong. That made it harder. If he had been rude or pushy or obviously trying to take over, I could have pointed to it. I could have justified how I felt, but he was just good at being liked, and over time that made a difference. One evening I was scrolling through social media and saw something that made my stomach drop a little. Jason had posted a photo, nothing crazy. Just a casual picture of him and Mark at some bar. Caption, needed this. That was it, 2 words, but they hit harder than they should have, because that used to be us, not the photo itself, but the sentiment, the spontaneous hangouts, the needed this kind of moments, and I hadn't even known they went out that night. I stared at the post for a while, then closed the app, told myself I was overthinking it. Again, but the feeling didn't go away. A few days later, something else happened. We were all hanging out again, smaller group this time. Just me, Jason, Mark, and one other friend. At some point, the conversation shifted to work. People venting, talking about stress, that kind of thing. Jason started talking about something going on at his job, and without even thinking about it, I jumped in, started offering advice, because that's what I'd always done. That had kind of been my role, listening, helping, giving input. But halfway through what I was saying, Mark spoke. Not over me, not loudly, just smoothly, like he had been waiting for a natural opening. Honestly, he said, I think you're overcomplicating it. Jason turned to him immediately. What do you mean? And just like that, the focus shifted. Again, Mark explained his perspective. Simple, direct, confident, and Jason nodded. Yeah, that actually makes sense. I sat there for a second, realizing no one had acknowledged what I had just said, not even to disagree, just skipped. Like it hadn't been part of the conversation. And I know how that sounds, petty, small, but when it happens enough times it stops feeling small, it starts feeling like a pattern. Later that night I found myself talking less, not because I was upset, but because what was the point? That thought came out of nowhere, and I didn't like it, because it wasn't how I usually thought about my friends, but it was there, quiet, persistent. What's the point? At one point, Mark got up to grab drinks again. Came back, handed one to Jason, one to the other guy, then paused for half a second when he got to me. Not long, just enough to notice. Then handed it over. Here you go. I said thanks, but something about that tiny hesitation stuck with me, because it felt like he was thinking, calculating, not in a sinister way, just aware of dynamics, aware of positioning, and maybe I was reading too much into it, but at that point I didn't think I was. When I got home that night, I sat on my couch and just replayed everything in my head. Not just that evening, The past few weeks, the slow shift, the small moments, the patterns. And for the first time I asked myself a question I hadn't wanted to ask before. Was I actually being replaced, or was I just not adapting? Because groups change, people change, dynamics shift, that's normal. But this didn't feel like a natural evolution, it felt directional. Like something was being filled, and I just happened to be the space that got filled in. I didn't know what to do with that thought, so I did nothing. Which, looking back, was probably the worst option, because things don't stay the same when you do nothing. They just keep moving without you. For a while I tried to convince myself to just let it go. Not everything has to mean something. Not every shift is personal. That's what I kept telling myself, and honestly, part of me believed it. Because confronting something like this is messy. What do you even say? Hey, I feel like I'm being slowly replaced in the friend group. That sounds ridiculous, like something you laugh off if someone else said it. So instead of saying anything, I adjusted, or at least I tried to. I started being more active again, jumping back into conversations, making more of an effort during hangouts, trying to reclaim that space without making it obvious that I was trying, and for a little while. It worked, at least on the surface. I got more responses in the group chat, more engagement in conversations, more presence, but something felt off about it because it wasn't natural anymore. It felt like effort, like I was competing for attention in a space where I had never had to before. And once you feel that, it changes how you see everything. One night I decided to do something simple. I messaged Jason directly. Just, hey, you want to grab food sometime this week? Just us. There was a pause, not immediate but noticeable. Then he replied, yeah, I'm down. Followed by, maybe we can invite Mark too. I stared at the message, read it twice, then a third time, because again on paper it's harmless, inclusive, friendly, but in context it felt like something else. Like the idea of it just being us was no longer the default. I didn't respond right away. Just sat there, phone in my hand, trying to figure out why that bothered me as much as it did. Eventually I typed back, I was thinking just us, but we can do group stuff another time. Another pause, then, oh yeah, for sure, my bad. We said a day, locked it in. And for a second I felt better, like maybe I was overthinking everything, like things could still be normal. But when we actually met up, it didn't feel normal, not bad, just different. There were gaps in the conversation where there hadn't been before, moments where we both seemed to be searching for something to say. Not because we didn't have anything to talk about, but because the dynamic had shifted and neither of us had acknowledged it. At one point, Jason mentioned something about a movie, then said, oh, Mark was telling me, and stopped, mid-sentence, like he realized what he was doing, then corrected himself. I mean, I saw something about it online. I noticed it. He noticed that I noticed, and we both just moved on. But that moment said more than anything else had. Because it showed that even he was aware of the shift, at least on some level. The rest of the night was fine. We laughed, talked, nothing went wrong, but it didn't feel the same, and that's when I realized something important. It's not always about something breaking. Sometimes it's about something being replaced, quietly, gradually, until the original version doesn't really exist anymore. After that, I stopped trying to force things back to how they were, because I understood something I hadn't before. You can't recreate a dynamic once it's changed. You can only move forward within the new one. The question was, what did moving forward look like? Because staying in the same position I was in didn't feel right anymore, but leaving entirely didn't feel right either. So I stayed, in that in-between space, not as central as before, not completely removed, just there, and for a while that was enough, until it was. Because there's a point where being kind of included starts to feel worse than being left out entirely. And I was getting close to that point, I just didn't know it yet. The moment it stopped being manageable was surprisingly small, not dramatic, not explosive, just clear. It was a Friday night, nothing planned, no group hangout. I was at home just relaxing, scrolling through my phone, half watching something in the background. At some point, I opened social media without really thinking. And there it was again, a photo. This time not just Jason and Mark, the whole group, at a place we used to go to all the time, same table, same setup, same kind of night. Except I wasn't there and I hadn't even known it was happening. I stared at the picture for a long time, zoomed in, looked at everyone's faces, trying to figure out if there was something I had missed, some message, some invite, some mention in the group chat. There was, I went back to the chat, scrolled up. Nothing, no plan. No who's free tonight, no casual mention, just silence, and then the picture. That's when it clicked, not fully, but enough. This wasn't just about shifting dynamics anymore. This was about access, information, inclusion, because before, even if plans were last minute, I would have known, someone would have texted, someone would have said something. Now they hadn't, and I didn't know if that was intentional or just natural, which somehow made it worse. Because if it was intentional, at least there was a reason. If it was, then I had just stopped being part of the equation. I didn't react, didn't message anyone, didn't comment on the post. I just put my phone down and sat there for a while. And for the first time since all of this started, I didn't feel confused. I didn't feel unsure. I felt certain. Not about everything, but about one thing. Something had changed in a way that wasn't temporary. This wasn't a phase. This wasn't something that would go back to normal. This was the new normal, and I had to decide what to do with that. The next day I got a message from Jason. Hey, sorry man, last night was kinda last minute. I read it, then read it again because it was exactly what I expected, and somehow that made it worse because it confirmed something. He knew, not necessarily that I felt replaced, but that I might feel left out, and instead of preventing that, he addressed it after the fact. Which is a very different thing. I replied, all good, because what else was I going to say? Actually, it's not all good. That would open a conversation I wasn't sure I was ready to have, so I kept it simple, neutral, closed, but internally something shifted. That quiet, lingering doubt I'd been carrying for weeks turned into clarity. And clarity in situations like this isn't always comforting, because once you understand what's happening, you can't pretend you don't. Later that evening, the group chat picked up again. People talking about the night before. Jokes, photos, comments. I read through it, didn't respond, didn't react, just observed, and I noticed something. The way they talked about it didn't include me, not directly, not intentionally, but the language, the references. The remember when it was all internal, shared between people who had been there, and I was outside of it. Again, nothing wrong with that. People hang out without everyone all the time, but combined with everything else, it felt different. It felt like I had missed something more than just a night. I had missed a step, and now I was one behind. That night I muted the group chat, not out of anger, not out of spite, just for space. Because watching it in real time was exhausting, and I needed to step back, not permanently, just enough to think clearly, because I knew one thing now. I couldn't just stay in this passive state anymore. Waiting, observing, hoping things would shift back. They wouldn't, so either I adjusted or I addressed it, and both options felt uncomfortable. But doing nothing was no longer an option at all. I left the group chat muted for a few days, not as some dramatic statement. No one even noticed. That's the thing about stepping back quietly, it rarely creates a reaction. It just creates space, and in that space I started thinking more clearly. Without the constant updates, without the reminders of things I wasn't part of, just distance. And with that distance came a realization I hadn't fully allowed myself to accept yet. I had been waiting for things to feel like they used to, waiting for Jason to reach out the same way, waiting for the dynamic to somehow reset itself. But that's not how it works. People don't rewind, they move forward with or without you, and in this case they had. That didn't necessarily mean I didn't belong anymore, but it did mean that my place had changed. And the longer I pretended it hadn't, the worse it felt, so I made a decision, not a big one, just a simple one. I was going to talk to Jason, not confrontational, not accusatory, just honest, which honestly felt harder than anything else, because honesty in situations like this makes you feel exposed, like you're admitting something you're not even sure is valid. Still, I texted him. Hey, can we talk sometime? Nothing serious, just want to catch up properly. He replied pretty quickly. Yeah, of course, you good. I paused for a second before answering. Yeah, just want to talk. We set a time for the next day, same place as before, same casual setup, but this time it didn't feel casual, at least not for me. When I got there, he was already sitting at the table, same as last time, and for a moment everything felt normal again. We said hey, ordered food. Made small talk, but there was this underlying awareness that this wasn't just a regular hangout. Eventually, there was a pause in the conversation, one of those natural gaps, and instead of filling it with something random, I just said it. Hey, I wanted to ask you something. He looked at me, not defensive, just attentive. What's up? I hesitated for maybe half a second. Then, do you feel like things have been different lately? There it was, simple, open-ended, not accusing, just honest. He leaned back slightly, thought about it, then nodded. Yeah, a little. That surprised me. I expected deflection or confusion, not agreement. I asked, in what way? He shrugged. I don't know, just feels like everyone's been doing their own thing more. That wasn't wrong, but it also wasn't the whole picture, so I pushed a little further. I guess what I mean is between us. He didn't answer immediately, and that silence said more than words would have. Because it meant he knew what I was talking about, he just didn't know how to respond. After a few seconds he said, I didn't think it was a big deal. And there it was, not dismissive, not cold, just honest, and that's what made it hit, because for him it wasn't a big deal. For me it had been building for weeks, maybe longer. I nodded slowly. Yeah, I get that. Then I added, I think it kind of is though, at least for me. He looked at me more directly now. Actually focused, and for the first time in a while it felt like I had his full attention. I didn't go into everything, didn't list out every moment, every pattern. That would have sounded like I'd been keeping score, which in a way I had, but that wasn't the point, so I kept it simple. I just feel like I'm not really part of things the same way anymore. There was another pause, but this one felt different. He wasn't avoiding it, he was thinking. Then he said, I didn't realize you felt like that. And I believed him. That's the frustrating part. I actually believed him. Because from his perspective, nothing had changed in a dramatic way. No conflict, no falling out, just new connections forming, new habits, new routines, and I had just drifted slightly out of the center of that, not intentionally, just naturally. We talked for a while after that, nothing explosive, no big resolution, just clarity. He said he'd been hanging out with Mark more because they had similar schedules, similar interests. It was easy, convenient, and over time that just became the default, not instead of me. Just alongside, but alongside doesn't always feel equal, and I think that's what he hadn't realized. By the end of the conversation, nothing had been fixed, but something had shifted, not the dynamic itself, but the understanding of it, and sometimes that's the first step. Even if it's not the outcome you were hoping for, after that conversation, things didn't magically go back to how they were, and honestly, I didn't expect them to. That wasn't really the point. The point was that everything was out in the open now, at least between me and Jason. No more guessing, no more trying to interpret small moments. We both understood that something had changed. The difference was now we knew why. For the next couple of weeks, there was a noticeable effort from him. He reached out more, sent me random messages again, asked if I wanted to hang out, just us, and we did, a couple times, and those hangouts were good, not forced, not awkward, just familiar, like something had been adjusted slightly back into place. But here's the thing, even when something improves, it doesn't always return to its original form, because the context is different now, the awareness is there, and once you're aware of something, you see it everywhere. During group hangouts, I noticed it again, not as sharp as before, but still there. The way conversations naturally flowed toward Mark, the way he filled space effortlessly, the way people responded to him, and the way I now recognized it in real time, but instead of feeling pushed out, it felt clearer, like I finally understood the structure of what was happening. Mark wasn't replacing me in a direct sense. He was filling a role that I had partially stepped away from, not intentionally. But gradually, and once that space opened up, he stepped into it, and did it well. That's the uncomfortable truth. He was good at it, good at engaging, good at remembering things, good at being present, and those are the things that naturally pull people toward you. So it wasn't about him taking something from me. It was about him offering something that people responded to, and me not doing that in the same way anymore. That realization changed how I saw everything because it removed the idea of blame. There wasn't a villain here, just shifting dynamics, still uncomfortable. But less personal. One night during a group hangout, something happened that kind of confirmed all of this. We were sitting around, talking like usual. At some point, someone asked about plans for the next weekend. There was a brief pause. Then Mark said we could do something Saturday, and immediately people started responding, throwing out ideas, same pattern as before, but this time I didn't feel the need to jump in. Didn't feel the urge to reclaim that space. I just listened. Watched the conversation unfold and realized something. I didn't actually want that role anymore, not in the same way, because maintaining it required energy, attention, consistency, and somewhere along the way I had stopped wanting to put that energy into this specific group dynamic, not because I didn't care about them, but because I had changed too. That was the part I hadn't fully acknowledged before. It wasn't just the group evolving, it was me evolving alongside it. Just in a different direction. And once I saw that, everything felt a little lighter, because it wasn't about losing something, it was about outgrowing a certain version of it. That doesn't make it easy, but it makes sense. After that, I started approaching things differently. I still showed up, still engaged, still joked around, but without the pressure of needing to be central. And weirdly, that made everything feel more natural again, not like before, but not strained either, just different. And maybe that's the best way to describe it. Different doesn't always mean worse. Sometimes it just means changed. And the real challenge is figuring out whether you can be okay with that, or if you need something else entirely. I wasn't fully sure yet, but for the first time since all of this started, I felt like I wasn't stuck anymore. I was just choosing how to move forward. Over time, things settled into something stable, not identical to how they used to be. But not uncomfortable anymore either, just different, and once I stopped comparing it to the past, it became easier to accept. I still saw the group regularly, still laughed at the same jokes, still had those moments where everything felt easy and familiar. But I wasn't trying to hold onto a role that didn't fit the same way anymore, and that made a bigger difference than I expected. Jason and I stayed close, not in that constant, automatic way we used to be, but in a more intentional way. We'd check in, make plans occasionally, actually choose to spend time together instead of just defaulting into it. And in a strange way, that made it feel more real, because it wasn't just habit anymore, it was effort, and effort means something. As for Mark, nothing dramatic happened, no confrontation, no tension. He just continued being himself, part of the group, comfortable, integrated. And once I stopped viewing him as the person replacing me, it got easier to just see him as another person. Someone who brought something different to the table, not better, not worse, just different. And I think that shift in perspective was the most important part, because before that, everything felt like a competition I hadn't signed up for. After that, it just felt like a group of people evolving. Naturally, there were still moments though, small ones, where I'd notice something and feel that old flicker, a conversation I wasn't part of, a plan I wasn't included in right away, a joke that landed differently. But those moments didn't stick the same way anymore, because I understood them. They weren't signs that I didn't belong. They were just signs that I didn't occupy the exact same space as before, and that's okay. It has to be, because nothing stays exactly the same. Not friendships, not group dynamics, not even who you are within those spaces. Everything shifts. The real question is whether you can shift with it, or if you need to find something that fits you better. For me, it ended up being a bit of both. I kept the friendships, but I also started building new ones, different environments, different people, different energy, not as a replacement, just as an expansion. Because relying on one group to stay exactly the same forever is kind of unrealistic, and honestly a little unfair, to them, and to yourself. Looking back now, I don't think I was ever truly being replaced. Just felt that way because I was holding onto a version of things that no longer existed. And once I let go of that, everything made more sense. It didn't fix everything instantly, but it gave me clarity, and sometimes that's more important than getting things back to normal. Because normal changes, whether you want it to or not, and learning how to exist in that change, that's the part no one really prepares you for. But once you figure it out, it gets a lot easier to breathe. All right. That one was a little more subtle. Not dramatic, not explosive, but the kind of thing that slowly gets under your skin the more you think about it. If you've ever felt like a dynamic changed without you realizing when or why, you probably know exactly what that feels like. Take a second, relax a bit, maybe stretch, adjust your position, grab some water if you need it, and when you're ready, let's move on to the next story. Alright, this next one starts off pretty normal. Actually. More than normal, it starts off good. The kind of situation where everything lines up a little too well, and at first you don't question it, because why would you? So this happened about a year and a half ago. I had just left a job I'd been at for almost 3 years. Nothing dramatic, no big fallout, no crazy story. I was just burned out. Long hours, repetitive work, not much room to grow. You know, the kind of job where every day feels exactly the same. Yeah, that, so I quit. Took a couple weeks off to reset, then started applying again. Not urgently, just casually, seeing what was out there. And that's when I found this job, or more accurately, this job found me. I got an email out of nowhere, no prior application, no connection, just a recruiter reaching out, saying they'd come across my profile and thought I'd be a great fit for a position at a small company. The email itself was well written, not generic. Not one of those copy-paste messages you can spot instantly. It mentioned specific things from my background, projects I had worked on, skills I actually had, which immediately made it feel more legitimate, more targeted, so I responded. Figured why not, worst case it goes nowhere, best case it's a good opportunity. They got back to me quickly, like really quickly. Within a couple hours, we set up an interview for the next day. Again fast, but not impossibly fast, just efficient, that's what I told myself. The interview was over video, 3 people on the call, all friendly, all professional. They asked good questions, not surface-level stuff. Actual thoughtful questions about how I approached work, how I handled problems, how I thought about long-term growth. It felt real, and by the end of it I felt good. Not just maybe I did okay good, actually good, like I had connected with them, like it made sense. At the end of the call, one of them said, "We'll get back to you soon." Standard, expected, but soon turned out to be later that same day. Offer, full-time, remote, better pay than my last job, flexible hours, and the role itself was basically everything I had been looking for. It was perfect. And I remember sitting there staring at the email thinking, is this too easy? That thought crossed my mind, briefly, but I pushed it aside, because when something good happens, you don't want to be the person who ruins it by overthinking. So I accepted, signed the paperwork, went through onboarding, everything looked legitimate. Contracts, company documents, internal systems, nothing felt fake, nothing felt off, just smooth, almost too smooth. My first day was a Monday, no big orientation, no overwhelming introductions, just a few messages from the team, a welcome call, and then work, real work, tasks assigned, deadlines set, systems in place. It felt like I had stepped into something already running, which isn't unusual for a small company, but what stood out was how quickly I was trusted. Within the first week, I had access to everything, internal docs, client files, communication channels, more than I had expected, more than I had at my previous job, even after months, and when I asked about it, they just said, "We like to trust people early," which sounded progressive, modern, the kind of thing companies say they do, except this time they actually did it. First, it felt great, empowering, like they respected me, like I was already part of the core team. But then little things start to feel strange, not wrong, just slightly off, like the edges of something didn't quite line up. The first thing I noticed was the communication. Everything was controlled, not in an obvious way. No one said don't talk about this or keep things secret. But conversations always stayed narrow, focused, if I asked about something outside my immediate tasks. The answers were vague, not dismissive, just incomplete, like, yeah, that, handled by another team, or we'll get into that later. Except later never came. Then there were the meetings. We had regular team calls, weekly, sometimes more, and they were always efficient, almost too efficient. No small talk, no off-topic conversations, just agenda right arrow discussion, done, which sounds great, right, until you realize there's no room for anything else. No room to understand the people you're working with, no room to build actual connections. It felt less like a team and more like a system. And the more I paid attention, the more I realized something else. I didn't actually know anyone there, not really. I knew their names, their roles, their voices, but beyond that, nothing. No casual conversations, no shared moments, no personality, just function. And that's when the thought came back, the one I had ignored at the beginning, is this too easy? Except now it didn't feel like a good thing anymore. It felt like a question I should have taken more seriously. At first, I tried to ignore it, because on paper everything was still great, the work was manageable. The pay was better than anything I'd had before. No commute, no office politics, no micromanaging. It was the kind of setup people want. So whenever the uneasy feeling came up, I pushed it down. Told myself I was just adjusting to a different kind of environment. But the longer I stayed, the harder it became to ignore the details. The second thing I noticed was how disconnected everything felt, not disorganized. Actually, the opposite. Everything was too organized. Files were structured perfectly. Processes were clearly defined. Instructions were always precise. There was never confusion about what needed to be done, which sounds ideal, until you realize there's no room for questions. Not because you're not allowed to ask, but because everything is already answered in advance before you even think to ask it. And that creates a weird dynamic, because instead of learning how things work, you're just following, step by step, like you've been dropped into the middle of a system that already expects you to operate at full speed. No onboarding period, no gradual ramp-up, just immediate integration. I remember one task in particular. It involved working with client data. Nothing unusual for my field, but the level of access I had didn't feel right. I could see everything. Full datasets, internal notes, client communication history, more than I had ever been given at previous jobs, even after months of trust building. So I asked about it, casually. Hey, just wanted to check, is it normal that I have access to all of this already? The response came quickly. Yeah, we believe in transparency and trust. Same phrase, same tone, like it had been said before, many times. I accepted it, again, because technically there was nothing wrong with that answer, but something about it felt rehearsed, not fake, just too consistent. Then there was the pace. Everything moved fast, not in a chaotic way. In a controlled way, tasks came in, tasks got done. New tasks appeared immediately after. There was no downtime, no natural pauses, no moments where things slowed down enough to step back and think. It was just continuous. And I didn't realize how strange that was until about 3 weeks in. Because most jobs, even busy ones, have fluctuations. Slow days, quiet hours, moments where things breathe. This didn't. It was like the system was designed to keep everything moving at a steady, constant speed. No variation, no gaps, and over time that started to feel less efficient and more intentional. Like the pace itself was part of something I didn't fully understand yet. Around the end of the first month, I decided to try something, not a test exactly, just curiosity. I reached out to one of my coworkers directly, someone I had interacted with a few times during projects. Nothing unusual, just a message. Hey, how long have you been working here? Simple, normal, the kind of thing you'd ask anywhere else without thinking twice. The reply came a few minutes later. About a year, that was it. No follow-up, no what about you, no conversation, just an answer. So I tried again. How do you like it so far? Another pause. Then it's good, efficient, that word again. Efficient. I stared at the message for a second because it felt incomplete, like something was missing, not just from the answer but from the interaction itself. No personality, no opinion, just a functional response like everything else. After that, I stopped trying to have side conversations, not because I couldn't, but because they didn't go anywhere. Everything funneled back into work, always. Then came the moment that really started to shift things for me. It was during one of our weekly calls. We were going through updates like usual, everyone reporting on their tasks, progress, metrics, all very standard. Then one of the team members mentioned something, a small issue, nothing major, just a minor delay on a project, something that would normally lead to a quick discussion, problem solving, adjustments. Instead, there was silence for about 2 seconds. Then one of the managers spoke. Let's keep things on track moving forward. That was it, no questions, no follow-up, no attempt to understand what caused the delay, just correction, and then the meeting moved on like it hadn't happened. I remember sitting there listening and feeling something click, because that wasn't normal. In any team environment, you talk through issues, you figure out what went wrong, you adjust, but here there was no space for that. Mistakes weren't explored, they were acknowledged and closed, quickly, efficiently, and that word started to take on a different meaning in my head. It wasn't just about productivity anymore, it was about control, keeping everything within a certain structure. A certain flow, no deviations, no disruptions. And once I saw that, I started seeing it everywhere. In the way people spoke, in the way conversations were handled, in the way information was shared or not shared. Everything stayed within boundaries, invisible ones, but very real. And I realized something that made me pause. I still didn't know what the company actually did. Not fully. I knew my role, my tasks, the clients I interacted with, but the bigger picture, the purpose, the structure, it was all vague, like I was working inside a machine without ever seeing the whole thing. And that's when the feeling changed, from curiosity to something closer to concern, because it's one thing to be part of a well-run system, it's another to not understand the system at all. And at that point, I was starting to wonder if that was by design. By the start of the second month, that feeling had settled in. Not panic, not fear, just unease, the kind that sits quietly in the background and doesn't go away. I was still doing my work, still meeting deadlines, still getting positive feedback. Nothing was wrong in the obvious sense, but the more comfortable I became with the tasks, the more uncomfortable I became with everything around them. The next thing I noticed was the lack of variation, not just in workload, in people. Everyone sounded similar, not in their voices, in how they spoke. The same tone, the same phrasing, the same kind of responses, concise, neutral, controlled. At first, I thought it was just a company culture thing. Some places lean more formal, more structured, but this wasn't just formal, it was uniform, like everyone had learned the same way to communicate. Or had been taught to, and once that thought crossed my mind, I couldn't unhear it. During meetings, I started paying more attention. Not to what people were saying, but how they were saying it, and it was always the same pattern. Short updates, no personal input, no extra commentary, just information, delivered cleanly. Then silence, waiting for the next person. No overlap, no interruptions, no natural flow. It felt less like a conversation and more like a sequence, predefined. And perfectly executed. At one point, I decided to break that pattern, just slightly. During a call after giving my update, I added something extra, nothing major, just a small observation about the project. A suggestion, the kind of thing that would normally lead to discussion. There was a pause, longer than usual, not awkward, just unexpected. Then the manager responded, "Let's stay aligned with the current structure." And that was it. No engagement, no acknowledgement of the idea itself. Just a redirect back to the system. That's when I stopped trying to add anything outside of what was expected, because it was clear that wasn't what they wanted. Around the same time, I started noticing something else. Turnover, but not in the usual way. No one announced they were leaving, no farewell messages, no last day calls. People just stopped appearing. One week someone would be in meetings, the next they were, and no one mentioned it at all. No explanation, no acknowledgement. Just absence. At first I thought maybe I had missed something. Maybe it had been discussed somewhere else. So I checked, emails, internal channels, nothing. It was like those people had never been there. Which again is not normal. Even in large companies there's some kind of transition. Here, there was none, and the way everyone else reacted or didn't react made it even stranger. No questions, no curiosity, no disruption, just continuation, like the system adjusted automatically. And kept going. That was the moment the word efficient started to feel different again, because efficiency usually removes friction, but here it felt like it was removing people, quietly, seamlessly, without leaving a trace. One afternoon I decided to check something I hadn't looked at yet, the company website. I had glanced at it when I first got the offer, but I hadn't really studied it. Now I did, and the more I looked, the more vague it felt. General descriptions. Broad statements, nothing specific. No detailed breakdown of services. No clear explanation of how everything connected. Just polished language that sounded impressive without actually saying much. I clicked through every page. About services, team. The team section had names, photos, titles, but even that felt off. The photos looked professional, too professional, like stock images. And when I tried to search for a few of the names online, nothing came up. No LinkedIn, no profiles. No history, which doesn't mean anything on its own. Some people just don't have a strong online presence, but when it's everyone, that's different. I leaned back in my chair and just sat there for a minute, because now the pieces weren't just off. They were starting to form a pattern, one that I didn't fully understand yet, but couldn't ignore anymore. Still, I stayed, because leaving based on a feeling feels irrational, especially when everything else looks good. Stable income, remote work. No obvious problems. So I told myself, give it more time, see if things become clearer. Maybe there's an explanation. Maybe it all makes sense once you're deeper in. But deep down I had a feeling that the deeper I went, the less sense it was going to make. By the middle of the second month, I stopped thinking of it as just a feeling. At that point, it was something I was actively trying to understand, not out of curiosity anymore, out of necessity. Because the more I worked, the more I realized something important. I was doing tasks, but I didn't fully understand why those tasks existed. Not in a big picture sense, and that's unusual. Even in highly specialized roles, you usually have at least a general understanding of how your work fits into the larger system. Here, that connection was missing. So I started paying closer attention to the work itself, looking for patterns, trying to trace where things came from and where they went. At first, everything seemed normal. Data came in, it got processed, output was generated, sent somewhere, standard workflow. But when I tried to follow that somewhere, that's where things got unclear, because the outputs didn't lead to anything visible. No clear client responses, no follow-up tasks, no feedback loops, just completion, as if the end of the task was the end of the process, which doesn't make sense in most real-world systems. Work usually leads to something, a result. A reaction, a next step. Here, it just stopped. And the more I looked, the more I realized that was consistent across everything. Work came in, work got done, work disappeared. Like it was being fed into something, but whatever that something was, I couldn't see it. That's when I made another decision, this time more deliberate. I was going to ask direct questions, not vague ones, not casual ones, actual specific questions about how things worked. So during the next team call, when there was a natural opening, I asked, "Hey, quick question, how does the work we're doing here tie into the bigger system?" Like, what happens after we complete these tasks? Silence, not long but noticeable. Then the manager responded, it contributes to overall operations. That was it. I waited, thinking maybe he'd expand. He didn't, so I followed up. Right, but where does it go after that? Another pause, then, it's handled downstream. And just like that, the conversation moved on. No one else asked anything. No one reacted, just continuation. And that was the moment I realized something very clearly. The system wasn't just structured, it was closed. Information flowed in one direction, and only as much as was necessary, nothing more. After that call, I sat there for a while thinking, because now I had a choice. I could keep working, ignore the gaps, take the money, stay comfortable, or I could push further. And risk whatever that might lead to. At that point, I wasn't ready to leave, but I also wasn't comfortable staying passive, so I took a middle approach. I started documenting things, not in a paranoid way, just notes, what I worked on, where it came from, what happened to it after, patterns, timelines, anything that might help me understand the bigger picture. And over the next couple of weeks, something started to emerge, not a full picture, but enough to notice. The work I was doing was part of a cycle, not a progression. A loop, data came in, got processed, produced output. Then eventually similar data came back again, slightly altered, slightly shifted, but recognizable, like it had gone through the system and returned. That didn't make sense, unless the system wasn't producing external results, unless it was feeding itself. That thought sat in my mind for a while, because it sounded ridiculous. Why would a company operate like that? What would be the purpose? But the more I looked, the more it fit, and that's when the unease turned into something else. Not fear, not yet, but something close to it, because now it wasn't just that I didn't understand the system. It was that the system might not be what I thought it was at all, and that raised a much bigger question, one I hadn't wanted to ask before. What exactly had I signed up for? Once that thought settled in, I couldn't ignore it anymore. Before, everything had been subtle enough to question. Now it felt intentional, not necessarily malicious, but definitely designed, and that's what made it different, because if something is designed that way, there's a reason. I just didn't know what it was. At that point, I started being more careful, not outwardly. I still did my work, still followed instructions, still showed up to meetings. But internally, I shifted from participating to observing, watching how things moved, how information flowed, how people responded, and more importantly, what didn't happen. The biggest thing that stood out was still the absence of feedback, not just from the team, from anywhere. No client responses, no performance reviews, no outcomes, just tasks completed, over and over, like the value of the work wasn't in what it produced but in the fact that it was being done, which doesn't make sense in a normal business. Work has a purpose, an output, a goal. Here, the goal seemed to be continuation. That's when I decided to take a closer look at the data itself, the stuff I was working with, because if I couldn't see where it was going, maybe I could understand what it was. At first glance, it looked standard, structured, clean, nothing obviously wrong, but the more I worked with it, the more familiar it started to feel, not just in a general way, specifically, like I had seen certain patterns before, exact patterns, so I started comparing, old tasks, new tasks, different datasets. And after a while, I found it. Repetition, not identical, but close enough. Sections of data that had been processed before coming back, slightly modified, re-entering the system. Which meant one thing, the system wasn't just processing external input, it was recycling its own output and feeding it back in. That's not normal, at all. I leaned back in my chair and just stared at the screen for a minute, because now this wasn't just a weird company, this was something else. Something I didn't fully understand, but definitely didn't feel right. Still, I didn't act on it immediately, because jumping to conclusions without full information is dangerous. So I kept going, kept observing, kept documenting, and eventually I noticed something even stranger. Timing, the way tasks appeared was too consistent, not just regular, precise, like they were being generated on a schedule, not triggered by real-world events, just appearing at exact intervals, which again doesn't make sense for most workflows, unless the source of the tasks is internal. That thought connected with the data loop, and suddenly the whole thing started to form a shape, not a complete one, but enough to see the outline. A system that generates tasks, processes them, recycles the output, feeds it back in, and repeats over and over with people working inside it without seeing the full picture. I sat there for a long time after that realization, because if that was true, then what was the purpose? Why build something like that? What was it for? And more importantly, why hire people to work inside it? That's when I started thinking about something I hadn't considered before. What if the work itself wasn't the point? What if the process was? That idea didn't make sense at first. But the more I thought about it, the more it fit, because everything about this company was optimized for process, efficiency, consistency, control, not outcomes, not results, just operation. And if that was true, then the system didn't need to produce anything meaningful, it just needed to function. That realization didn't give me answers, but it gave me direction, because now I knew what I needed to figure out next. Not what the work was doing, but what the system was doing, and whether I wanted to be part of it, because at that point, it didn't feel like a job anymore. It felt like something I had stepped into without understanding what it actually was. And that's a very different situation. At that point, I knew I couldn't just stay passive anymore, not because something dramatic had happened, but because the pattern was too clear to ignore, so I made a decision. I was going to push further, not in an obvious way, not by directly confronting anyone, but by testing the edges of the system, seeing what happened when I stepped slightly outside of what was expected. The first test was small. I delayed a task, not by much. Just enough to see if anyone noticed. Normally, everything I did was on time, consistent, exactly as expected. This time, I let one task sit for a couple of hours longer than usual. No message, no explanation, just delay, and the response came, not from a person, from the system, an automated notification. Reminder, neutral tone, no emotion, just task pending, please proceed. That was normal, expected, so I waited longer. Another hour, then another. Still no direct message from a manager. No follow-up, just the system repeating the same reminder at precise intervals. Which told me something important. The system monitored activity, but the people didn't intervene immediately, or maybe didn't intervene at all. Eventually I completed the task, just to see what would happen. Nothing, no comment, no acknowledgement, just continuation. That confirmed something. The system didn't care how things were done, as long as they were done. Within a certain window, the second test was different. This time I changed something, not the outcome, just the process. I adjusted how I handled part of a task, still correct, still functional, but slightly outside the usual structure. And this time there was a response, not immediate, but during the next review cycle. A message, short, direct, please maintain alignment with standard procedures. No explanation, no discussion, just correction, which told me something else. Deviation wasn't allowed, not because it broke anything, but because it broke the structure. And that structure was clearly important, more important than flexibility, more important than improvement, just consistency. That's when I understood something I hadn't fully grasped before. This wasn't a system designed for people. It was a system designed for itself, and people were just there to keep it running. That thought sat heavy, because it changed the context of everything. The job, the company. My role, all of it. Around the same time something else happened. Another person disappeared. Someone I had worked with a few times, not closely, but enough to recognize their name. 1 week they were there, the next gone. No mention, no explanation, just absence. Same pattern as before, and this time I paid attention to how quickly the system adjusted. Tasks redistributed, workload balanced, no disruption, no delay, like nothing had changed. And that's when it hit me. The system didn't depend on individuals at all. Anyone could be removed and it would continue seamlessly. That's efficient, but it's also cold, because it means you're not really part of something. You're just filling a function, and once that function is no longer needed, you're gone. Quietly, just like the others. That realization didn't scare me in the immediate sense. It did something else. It made me feel disconnected, like I wasn't actually in the job anymore, just operating inside it, watching it, understanding it, but not belonging to it. And once that feeling sets in, it's hard to ignore, because it changes how you see everything. The tasks, the conversations, the people, or what you thought were people. Because at that point, I had another thought, one I hadn't wanted to consider before. What if not everything in this system was what it appeared to be? I didn't have proof, nothing concrete, but the patterns, the uniformity, the lack of variation. The absence of real interaction. It all pointed to something I didn't fully understand yet, but something I couldn't dismiss anymore. And that's when I realized I needed to make a decision soon. Because staying in a system you don't understand, especially one that feels designed this way, is not something you can do indefinitely. At some point you either accept it or you step out of it, and I wasn't sure I could accept it anymore. At that point I stopped thinking of it as a maybe. It wasn't a maybe anymore. It was something I was actively choosing to stay inside of, and that made it feel different, more intentional, because before I could tell myself I just didn't understand it yet. Now I understood enough to know it wasn't normal, and I was still there, still logging in, still completing tasks. Still participating in a system that felt detached from anything real. That's what finally pushed me to take the next step. I started looking for another job, not aggressively, not panicked, just quietly, updating my resume, sending out a few applications, reaching out to contacts. At the same time I kept working. Same routine, same tasks, same structure, but mentally I was already stepping out, observing more than engaging, waiting more than contributing, and the strange part was, the system didn't react, not at all. My output was still within expected ranges. My presence was still consistent, so from the system's perspective, nothing had changed, even though for me everything had. About a week into that process, something happened that made everything feel sharper, more real. I got a message, not from the system, from one of the managers. Short, direct, can you stay after the call today? That was new, in 2 months. No one had ever asked for a one-on-one conversation. Everything had always been group-based. Structured, predictable. This was, so I said yes. We had the regular team call, same format, same flow, nothing unusual. Then after it ended, it was just me and him for the first time. There was a brief pause, then he said, "You've been performing well." Neutral tone, no emotion, just statement. "Thanks," I said, then another pause, longer this time. And then, do you have any concerns about your role? That question caught me off guard, not because it was aggressive, but because it was precise, like it was aimed at something. I hesitated for a second, not because I didn't have an answer, but because I was deciding how much to say. Then I went with something safe, nothing major, just still getting a feel for how everything connects. That was true, just not the whole truth, he nodded, or at least his head moved slightly. Hard to tell through video. Focus on your assigned tasks, he said. Alignment is important. That word again, alignment, it came up a lot, more than normal, like it meant something specific in this context, more than just doing your job. Then he added, over time things become clearer. And that was it, conversation over, no elaboration, no discussion, just instruction. I left that call with a strange feeling, not fear but confirmation, because that didn't feel like a normal check-in. It felt like a calibration, like the system had detected something slightly off and adjusted it, subtly, without confrontation, without explanation. Just realignment, and the fact that it happened right when I had mentally started stepping back didn't feel like a coincidence. That night I made a decision, not gradual, not uncertain, clear. I was leaving, not eventually, not when I found something better. Soon, because whatever this system was, it wasn't something I wanted to be part of long term, not without understanding it, and I had a feeling understanding it fully wouldn't make it feel better, it would just make it clearer. And sometimes clarity is enough, you don't need the full picture, you just need to know it's not something you should stay in. The next morning I started applying more seriously, more focus, more urgency, still controlled, but intentional, because now I wasn't just looking for a better opportunity. I was looking for an exit, and once you reach that point, you don't really look at things the same way anymore. You're not part of the system, you're just passing through it until you're out. Once I made that decision, everything became simpler, not easier, but clearer. I stopped trying to understand the system, stopped trying to connect the dots. Because at that point, it didn't matter what it was, it only mattered that I didn't want to stay in it, so I shifted my focus completely. Work became mechanical, tasks in, tasks out. No curiosity, no extra effort, just completion. And outside of that, I focused on leaving. Applications, interviews, conversations, and within about 2 weeks something came through, a new offer, more traditional company, clear structure, clear purpose, actual people, the kind of job where you understand what you're doing and why you're doing it. I accepted immediately, no hesitation. And then came the part I had been thinking about for days. Resigning, I kept it simple. Short message, professional, standard notice, nothing unusual, and the response was exactly what I should have expected. Noted, thank you for your contribution. That was it, no questions, no follow-up, no attempt to retain me, no exit conversation, just acknowledgement and continuation, like I had already been removed from the system before I even left. My final days there felt strange, not emotional, not tense, just empty. I logged in. Completed tasks, logged out, no one said anything. No one asked anything, no difference, and on my last day nothing happened, no message, no goodbye, no recognition, just silence. And then access revoked, just like that. One moment I was in. The next I was, and the system kept going, exactly as it had before, no disruption, no trace. I sat there for a while after that, looking at my screen, because for 2 months I had been part of something structured. Something controlled, something I didn't fully understand. And now it was just gone, like stepping out of a room and realizing it never really needed you there. The new job felt completely different. Messier, slower, more human. People joked, talked, asked questions, made mistakes, explained things. And for the first time in a while, I felt like I was actually part of something, not just operating inside it, but being part of it, which made me realize something. The old job wasn't perfect. It just looked that way because everything unnecessary had been removed, including the parts that make something feel real. The imperfections, the conversations, the unpredictability, all the things that make a workplace feel human. Without those, you don't get chaos, but you also don't get connection, and that's what was missing. Not just for me, for everyone in that system, or whatever it was. I still think about it sometimes, not in a paranoid way, just in that quiet, reflective way. Because I never figured out exactly what it was, what the purpose was, why it was built that way, and part of me doesn't want to know, because sometimes not knowing is better than understanding something you can't unsee. All I know is this: it looked perfect from the outside, it felt efficient on the surface, but underneath it was something else entirely. And I'm glad I stepped out of it before I got used to it, because I think that's the real danger. Not that something feels wrong, but that eventually stops feeling wrong at all. All right, that one's a bit of a slow burn, the kind of story where nothing explodes, nothing dramatic happens, but the more you think about it, the stranger it gets. Take a moment, relax, maybe stretch a bit, adjust your position. If you're playing something in the background, keep it going. If you're trying to fall asleep, just let the next one play. Whenever you're ready, let's move into the next story. All right, this next story starts off simple, nothing dramatic. Just a small, weird moment, the kind you'd normally ignore, except this time it didn't stay small, so this happened a few months ago. I had just switched phones, nothing special, just an upgrade. New device, same number, same app, same everything, or at least that's what I thought. Setting it up was easy, transferred all my data, logged into everything. Contacts, messages, photos, all there. Normal, everything felt exactly like my old phone, which is what you want, right? No surprises. No complications, just continuity. For the first couple of days, nothing unusual happened. Texts came through, notifications worked, apps synced, all standard. Then on the third day, I got a message from a number I didn't recognize. That by itself isn't strange. Wrong numbers happen all the time. Spam messages, random texts, whatever. Usually you just ignore them. But this one didn't feel like a wrong number. It said, "Did you get home safe?" No name, no context, just that. I stared at it for a second, because the tone was familiar, not generic, not like a scam, more like something someone would actually send to someone they know. I checked the number, no contact saved, no previous conversation, just that one message. So I did what most people would do. I ignored it, figured if it was important they'd follow up, or realize they had the wrong number. And that would be the end of it. Except it was. About 10 minutes later, another message. Same number, you didn't answer, are you okay? That's when it shifted, because now it wasn't just a random text. It was concern directed at me specifically, which didn't make sense because I hadn't given anyone my new phone. Same number, sure, but still I didn't recognize the sender, so I replied just to clear it up. Hey, I think you have the wrong number. Simple, direct. That should have ended it, and for a few minutes it seemed like it did. No response, conversation over, except about an hour later my phone buzzed again. Same number, new message. That's not funny. I frowned at the screen because now it didn't feel like a mistake anymore. It felt like insistence, like whoever was texting me was sure they were talking to the right person, so I replied again. Seriously, I don't know who this is. A few seconds passed, then 3 dots, typing. Then the message came through. Stop. That was it, just one word, and I don't know why, but something about that felt wrong. Not aggressive, not threatening, just wrong. Like the tone had shifted from confusion to something else, something more controlled. I didn't respond, because at that point I didn't know what to say, and honestly, I didn't feel like continuing the conversation. So I put my phone down, tried to move on, told myself it was just someone being weird. It happens. People get numbers wrong, people react strangely, not everything has to mean something. But then later that night, I got another message. Same number, no context, no follow-up from before, just "you always do this." I sat there for a second, reading it over, because now this wasn't random anymore. This was personal, not to me, but to whoever they thought I was, and somehow that made it worse, because it meant I was now part of something that had nothing to do with me, at least. That's what I thought at the time, so I did the obvious thing. I blocked the number, end of story, or at least that's what I expected, because that's how this usually goes. Weird message, you block, it stops. Except the next morning I got another message from a different number, and it said, blocking me doesn't help. And that's when it stopped feeling like a coincidence, and started feeling like something else entirely. I didn't reply right away. I just sat there staring at the screen, trying to figure out the most reasonable explanation, because there had to be one. Right, wrong number, persistent sender, maybe someone messing with me, something normal, something explainable, but the message itself didn't feel normal. Blocking me doesn't help. That implies awareness, not just that I blocked the number, but that they expected me to, which doesn't line up with a simple mistake. Still, I responded, carefully, "Who is this?" Short. Neutral, no emotion. A few seconds passed. Then the typing dots appeared and stayed there, longer than usual, like whoever it was thinking. Then the message came through, "You know who it is." That's the kind of line that only works if it's true, if you actually know the person. Otherwise, it just creates confusion, and that's exactly what it did, because I didn't know at all, so I replied again, "I really don't." Another pause, then, "You're doing it again." That phrase again. Like this was a pattern, like this had happened before, except it hadn't, at least not for me. I checked the number, no contact, no previous messages, nothing, so I asked the obvious question, "What are you talking about?" This time the response came instantly, pretending. I stared at that word because it didn't clarify anything. It just made everything feel more intentional, like this wasn't confusion. This wasn't someone realizing their mistake. This was someone committed to the idea that I was someone else, and that I was lying about it. I didn't respond after that, because at that point there was no conversation to have. So I blocked that number too, and for a while that was it. No more messages, no more notifications, just silence, which should have been a relief, but it was, because now I knew it wasn't random. It had structure, consistency, awareness, and that kind of thing doesn't just disappear. Around noon that day I mentioned it to a friend, just casually, didn't make it sound serious, just like, "Hey, weird thing happened." I showed him the messages, he read through them, shrugged, "Probably someone messing with you." That was the obvious explanation, the easy one, and honestly I wanted it to be true, so I went with it, for a while, but that feeling didn't go away, that quiet sense that something didn't quite line up. Later that evening it came back, another message, another new number. No introduction, no hesitation, just, "You said you'd stop ignoring me." I didn't even feel surprised this time, just tired, because now there was a pattern, new number, same tone, same assumption, same certainty. I didn't reply, didn't even open the message fully at first, just let it sit there. But curiosity got the better of me, so I opened it, read it again, and noticed something I hadn't before, the phrasing, "You said you'd stop ignoring me." That implies a conversation. An agreement, something that had already happened. except it hadn't, not with me. Which means whoever this was continuing a conversation that I was never part of, and somehow I had been placed inside it. That's what made it unsettling, not the messages themselves, but the continuity, like I had stepped into the middle of something already in progress. And the other person hadn't noticed the difference, or worse, had noticed and didn't care. I blocked the third number. This point it felt automatic. Message right arrow block right arrow move on, except I wasn't moving on because now I was waiting, not actively but in the back of my mind, expecting the next one, and that's exactly what happened. The next morning, different number, same pattern. Why are you doing this? No greeting, no context, just frustration directed at me or at whoever they thought I was, and that's when I realized something. This wasn't going to stop, not because I was responding. Not because I was engaging, but because to them, this was still a conversation and I was still part of it, whether I wanted to be or not. That's when I started thinking about something I hadn't considered yet. What if this wasn't about the number? What if it wasn't a mistake or a prank or anything like that? What if somehow they were supposed to be reaching me? That thought didn't make sense, but it also didn't feel impossible anymore, because nothing about this situation felt normal. And the more it continued, the harder it became to explain it in normal ways. So instead of blocking the next number immediately, I did something different. I waited, and I decided the next time they messaged, I was going to push further, not to argue, not to correct them, but to understand, because at that point, not knowing felt worse than whatever the answer might be. The next message came that same night, different number, same tone. You can't just disappear like this. I didn't block it. Not this time. I opened the message and actually sat with it for a second, because now instead of reacting, I wanted to understand. There was a pattern here. Emotionally, it was consistent. Concern, right arrow, frustration, right arrow, accusation, right arrow, confusion. Like I was watching one side of a conversation unfold without ever seeing the beginning. So I replied, carefully, what do you think I did? I didn't deny anything, didn't say they had the wrong person, just asked. A few seconds passed, then you know exactly what you did. Same line as before, same assumption, same certainty, but this time I didn't push back, I changed the angle. Then explain it to me. Long pause, longer than any of the others. The typing dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Then finally, you left, that was it, 2 words, and suddenly there was context, not full context. But enough to shift things, because now this wasn't random anymore. This was about someone leaving, disappearing, cutting contact, and whoever this person was, they believed I was that person, so I asked the next question. When? Another pause, then 3 days ago. I frowned slightly, because that lined up almost perfectly. 3 days ago was when I switched phones, when everything reset, same number, new device, which shouldn't matter, except somehow it did. That coincidence sat there in my mind for a second. Then I asked, how do you have this number? This time the response was immediate. Don't do that. No answer, just resistance. Like the question itself was wrong, like I had broken some kind of rule, so I tried again, more direct. Where did you get my number? Pause, then you gave it to me. That made my stomach drop slightly, because that's not something you can easily explain away. If it's true, then at some point. There was a connection, except I had no memory of it. None, so I pushed a little further. When? This time the typing took longer, much longer. Then finally, last week. I leaned back slightly because now things didn't line up at all. Last week I hadn't met anyone new, hadn't given my number to anyone, hadn't had any interaction that would explain this. So either they were wrong or something else was going on. I didn't respond right away, just sat there thinking. Because now the situation had shifted, from weird to inconsistent, and inconsistencies are where things start to break, so I asked something simple. What's my name? That should settle it, right? If they know me, they know my name. If they don't, then this is clearly a mistake. Simple, clear, final. The typing dots appeared, stayed, disappeared, then came back again. Then finally the message came through. You're really doing this. Not an answer, just disappointment, like I had failed some kind of test. I stared at the screen, because that told me everything I needed to know. They couldn't answer, which meant they didn't actually know who I was, they just believed they did, and that's a very different situation. I replied one more time, clear, direct, you have the wrong person. No emotion, no argument, just fact. There was a long pause, longer than any before, then finally, no. That was it, just no. And somehow that was the most unsettling response so far, because it wasn't confusion. It wasn't denial, it was certainty, unshaken, unquestioned, and at that point I realized something. This wasn't going to resolve with logic, it wasn't going to end with clarification, because on their side there was no doubt. And when someone is that certain, it doesn't matter what you say, so I stopped responding. Didn't block the number this time, just left it, because now I wanted to see what would happen, without interference, without interruption. And part of me hoped that maybe, eventually, they would realize the mistake, that it would fade out. Stop, end, but deep down I already knew. This wasn't fadding, it was building, and I had just stepped deeper into it, without knowing what was on the other side. After that no, everything changed, not dramatically, not all at once, but the tone shifted. Before there had been confusion mixed with frustration. Now there was something else, something calmer, more controlled. The next message didn't come for a few hours, which was longer than before. Long enough that I almost thought it might actually stop. But it didn't. Around midnight, my phone buzzed again. Same number, new message, you're still there. I stared at that for a second because it wasn't a question. It was a statement, like they already knew, like they were confirming something. I didn't respond. I just watched the screen, waiting, and a minute later, another message. I can tell, that's when I felt it. That subtle shift from weird to unsettling, because now it wasn't just about mistaken identity. It felt like they were observing something, or at least believed they were. Still, I didn't reply. I wanted to see how far this would go, what they would say next without me influencing it. A few minutes passed. Then, you always stay quiet like this. That line again, always again, like there was history, like this pattern had played out before, except not with me, at least not that I knew of. I put my phone down, tried to ignore it. But that thought kept looping in my head. You always stay quiet like this. What does that even mean? The next morning I woke up to 3 new messages. Same number, all sent between 2 and 3 a.m. I waited. You didn't answer. You're doing it again. It felt repetitive now, predictable, but not in a comforting way, in a structured way, like a loop, the same emotional progression, over and over. And the more I saw it, the more it reminded me of something, not a conversation. Script, not in the sense that it was fake, but in the sense that it followed a pattern too closely, like the responses weren't adapting. They were repeating. I didn't respond that morning either. I went about my day. Work, errands, normal stuff, but the messages stayed in the back of my mind, because even when I wasn't looking at them, I knew they were there, waiting. Around noon, I got another one, new number this time, which meant they had switched again. You changed your number. I blinked at the screen. Because that was wrong. I hadn't. Same number, same everything, just a new phone. So I replied for the first time that day. No, I didn't. Almost instantly. Yes, you did. There was no hesitation, no doubt, just correction, like I had said something obviously false. I stared at that message for a second, because now we weren't just dealing with mistaken identity, we were dealing with conflicting realities. They believed something that wasn't true, and they weren't questioning it at all. So I asked, what makes you think that? Pause, then, you sound different. That made no sense. We hadn't spoken, only texted, so I replied, we haven't talked. And this time the response took longer, much longer. Then finally, you're really committing to this. That phrase again, like I was playing a role, like I was pretending, and they were watching it happen. At that point, I stopped trying to correct anything, because it was clear they weren't operating on the same baseline as me. So instead, I asked something else. Who do you think I am? The typing dots appeared, stayed, disappeared, came back, long pause, then no response, just silence. And that silence felt heavier than any of the messages, because it meant they couldn't answer, or didn't want to. Either way, it left a gap. One that made everything feel less grounded, less real. I didn't push it, I didn't follow up. I just let the conversation sit there, unresolved. And for a while, nothing happened. No messages. No new numbers, just quiet. But it wasn't the same kind of quiet as before. Before, quiet meant it was over. Now it felt like a pause, like something was still there, just waiting for the next move. And that feeling stayed with me longer than I wanted it to. That pause lasted almost a full day. No messages, no new numbers, nothing. And for the first time since this started, I almost relaxed. Not completely, but enough to think maybe it had finally run its course. Maybe whoever this was had realized something, or just stopped. But by that point I had learned something. Silence didn't mean it was over, it just meant it hadn't happened yet. And sure enough, that night it came back. Different number, no introduction, just I found you. I felt that one, not panic, but a shift, because up until that point everything had been reactive. Messages based on what I said or didn't say. This felt proactive, like something had changed on their end, so I replied. Not impulsively, carefully. What does that mean? A few seconds passed. Then, you're not where you said you were. That didn't make sense, because I hadn't said anything about where I was. Not in this conversation, not anywhere. So I asked, when did I say that? Pause, then before. That word again, before, like there was a timeline. A history, a sequence of events that I wasn't part of, or didn't remember. At that point, I started considering something I had been avoiding. Not because it made sense, but because nothing else did. What if this wasn't just a wrong number situation? What if, somehow, this number had been used before, by someone else, and I had just inherited it? That would explain the familiarity, the certainty, the references to past conversations. It wouldn't explain everything, but it would explain enough, so I tested it. Who did you talk to before this? Long pause, longer than usual. Then you. I exhaled slowly, because that answer didn't help at all, so I tried again, different angle. What name do you have saved for this number? The typing dots appeared, stayed, disappeared, then came back, then finally. You know I don't use names like that. That was new, different, more specific, and somehow more unsettling, because now it sounded like there were rules, not just assumptions, not just confusion. Rules, and I had just broken one. I didn't respond immediately. I just sat there thinking, because this wasn't random anymore. It had structure, language, consistency. Even if I didn't understand it, it was there. Then another message came through, same number. You said you'd stop asking questions. That one hit differently, because I hadn't, not in this conversation, but again it implied history. Promises, agreements, things that had already happened, just not with me. I put my phone down because at that point I didn't know what to say anymore, not in a way that would lead anywhere, and honestly I didn't know if I wanted to, because every time I engaged it went deeper, more specific, more structured. Like I was stepping further into something I didn't understand, but at the same time, not engaging didn't stop it either. It just continued, on its own. That night I didn't get any more messages, but I didn't sleep well, not because I was scared, but because my brain kept trying to solve it, trying to find a logical explanation, something grounded, something real. But every explanation I came up with fell apart because something always didn't line up. And that's the worst part of situations like this. Not that they're intense, but that they don't resolve, they just sit there, unanswered. The next morning I woke up to another message. New number, same tone, you're making this harder than it needs to be. I stared at that for a second, because now there was pressure, not aggressive, but directed, like I was doing something wrong by not playing along, so I replied, one more time, what do you want from me? This time the response came quickly. Just stop, that was it, and for the first time that felt like an actual answer. Not a question, not a continuation, just a request, or maybe an instruction. I didn't reply after that, because I didn't know what stop meant in this context. Stop responding, stop asking questions, stop existing in this conversation, and the more I thought about it, the less clear it became. So I did the only thing that made sense at that point. I stopped engaging, completely, no replies. No questions, nothing, and I waited to see what would happen next, because at this point that was the only way forward. Let it play out without interference and see where it went, even if I wasn't sure I wanted to know. After that I stopped completely. No replies, no questions, no reactions at all, and for a little while it actually worked. No messages that day, none the next morning, just silence. The kind that almost convinces you it's over. Almost, but not quite. Because by now I knew better. Silence wasn't the end, it was just a gap. And sure enough, that night it came back, different number, same pattern, but this time the message was shorter than anything before. Okay, that was it, just okay, no emotion, no accusation, no continuation, and somehow that felt different, like something had shifted, not stopped, just changed direction. I didn't respond, I stuck to the plan, no engagement, no matter what. A few minutes passed, then another message. Same number, we can do it your way. I stared at that for a second, because now it sounded like an agreement, like something had been negotiated, even though I hadn't said anything. Then no more questions, that phrase again. But this time it felt like a condition, like there were rules, and I had just accepted them without realizing it. I still didn't reply, I just watched and waited. A few minutes later, another message. Just stay where you are. That one hit differently. Because now it wasn't abstract anymore. It was physical, location, presence, instruction, and that's when I felt it. That shift from strange to uncomfortable. Not fear, not yet, but awareness, because now it wasn't just about messages, it was about me. Where I was, what I was doing, or at least what they thought I was doing. I didn't respond, didn't move, just sat there, phone in my hand, reading that line over and over again. Just stay where you are. I looked around my apartment. Everything normal, everything quiet, nothing out of place. And logically, there was no reason for that message to mean anything. But context changes everything. And in this context, it didn't feel random. It felt directed. I didn't sleep much that night, not because anything happened, but because of that one line. It stuck. The next morning I woke up and checked my phone. No new messages, no new numbers, just stillness, which at this point didn't feel like relief, it felt like waiting. Around midday I got another message. New number. Good. That was it, just good, like something had been confirmed, like I had done something right. Even though I hadn't done anything at all, I didn't reply. But now I was paying attention in a different way, not just to the messages, to timing, patterns, structure, because it didn't feel random anymore. It felt responsive, even without my input, which means something else was being used as input. That thought sat with me for a while. Because it didn't make sense, not in any normal way, but at the same time nothing about this had been normal, so instead of trying to explain it, I just observed, and over the next few hours I noticed something. The messages lined up with my activity, not perfectly, but close enough. When I moved around more, nothing. When I stayed still, message. When I checked my phone frequently, nothing. When I ignored it for a while, message. That could be coincidence, probably was. But when something happens enough times, it stops feeling like coincidence and starts feeling like a pattern. That's when I made another decision, not to respond, not to block, but to disrupt, break the pattern, see what happened. So I changed my routine, deliberately moved rooms, turned off notifications, left my phone in another part of the apartment for a while, came back, checked it, nothing. For a few hours nothing happened, and for the first time that felt like progress. Like maybe. Just maybe there was a way to step outside of it, to break whatever loop this was. But then late that night, I checked my phone again. And there it was, new number, new message, you're learning, and that's when I realized something. Whatever this was, it wasn't just continuing, it was adapting, and that made it something else entirely. After that message, you're learning, I stopped trying to rationalize it, because at that point it didn't matter how it was happening. What mattered was that it was happening. And it wasn't behaving like something random anymore. It was responding, adjusting, continuing even without my input. So I changed my approach completely. Instead of reacting, instead of observing, I decided to step out fully. I turned my phone off, not silent, not airplane mode, off completely for the first time since this started, and I left it that way. For hours, no checking, no thinking about it, just distance, and something interesting happened. For a while, I forgot about it. Not completely, but enough that it faded into the background. Because without the constant notifications, without the presence of the messages, it lost some of its weight, its immediacy, which told me something important. Part of what made it intense was the access, the constant connection. Remove that and it weakens, at least a little. Later that evening, I turned the phone back on, slowly, half expecting a flood of messages, something overwhelming, but when it powered up, there was only one. From a new number, of course, and it said, "That's not how this works." I exhaled quietly, because now there was confirmation, not just that it continued, but that it noticed, the absence, the break, the silence, which means the system, whatever it was, expected continuity, expected participation. And when that didn't happen, it responded. I didn't reply, I didn't engage, I just read it and put the phone down again. Because at that point, engagement felt like fuel, and I didn't want to fuel it anymore. Over the next day, the messages slowed, not stopped, but slowed, fewer numbers, more time between them, and the tone changed again, less emotional, less reactive, more neutral, like, "You're making this inefficient. This is unnecessary. It would be easier if you just responded." That word again, efficient, different context. Same feeling, like the goal wasn't communication, it was process, continuation, flow, and I had disrupted it, which made me think back to something. The way the messages had always followed a pattern, a structure, almost like a system, not just a person texting, something more consistent than that, and that's when a thought clicked into place. Not fully formed, but enough. What if this wasn't just one person? What if it was something else entirely? Something that used numbers, rotated them, maintained continuity, adjusted based on input or lack of input. I didn't have proof, still don't. But the behavior fit that idea more than anything else. And honestly, that thought didn't make it feel better, it just made it clearer. So I made one final decision. I got a new number, completely new, not a transfer, not an update, a full reset, new SIM, new account, new everything, and I didn't tell anyone about it right away. Not because I was hiding, just because I wanted to see. If the messages were tied to the number, then that would be the end of it, clean, simple, done, and for the first time since this started, I felt like I had some control again. Like I had stepped out of whatever loop I had been pulled into, and for a while it worked. No messages, no unknown numbers, no strange patterns, just silence, real silence, the kind that actually feels like an ending, not a pause, and I let myself believe that it was over, finally, completely, except about a week later I got a message, on my new number, from a number I didn't recognize, and it said, "This is better." And that's when I realized I hadn't stepped out of it, not completely, I had just moved it somewhere else. When that message came through on my new number, "This is better," I didn't react right away, I didn't panic, didn't respond, I just looked at it, because at that point, reacting felt pointless. It wasn't about stopping it anymore, it was about understanding what it actually was, or at least understanding my place in it. I hadn't given this number to anyone, not yet, no accounts linked, no apps synced, no contacts shared, it existed only on my phone, which meant one of two things. Either this was still tied to me somehow, not the number, me, or it had never been about the number at all. That thought didn't feel dramatic, it felt simple, like something I should have realized earlier. Because everything about this had always pointed in that direction. The continuity, the tone, the way it adapted, it wasn't trying to reach a number, it was trying to reach a person. And somehow that person had become me, not because I was the original target, but because I had stepped into the space where that target used to be, and instead of correcting itself, it just continued. That's what made it unsettling, not that it followed me, but that it didn't need to. Because it had already decided I was part of it, so I did something different. For the first time, I replied, not to argue, not to question, just to see. What is this? Simple, direct, no emotion. The typing dots appeared almost instantly, then stopped, then appeared again, then stopped, like whatever it was processing. Then finally the message came through, "You already know." I let out a quiet breath, because that was the same pattern, deflection, assumption, continuation. So I tried again, different angle. "No, I don't." This time the response was slower, more deliberate, and when it came it was different, not just in tone, in structure. It only works if you stop asking. I read that a few times because it wasn't aggressive, it wasn't emotional, it was instructional, like a rule, and suddenly everything clicked, not the details, not the origin, but the pattern. This wasn't about conversation, it wasn't about connection, it was about participation. The messages continued as long as I engaged in a certain way, as long as I stayed within the pattern. Question right arrow, response right arrow, continuation. Break that and it shifted, adapted, changed form, but never stopped, because stopping wasn't part of it, and that's when I realized something. I didn't need to understand it fully. I didn't need to know where it came from, or why it started, or who or what was behind it. I just needed to understand one thing, how to step out of it. Not by changing numbers, Not by blocking, not by asking questions, but by not participating at all, not even passively. So I stopped completely, no replies, no reading messages immediately, no checking unknown numbers. Nothing. I treated every unknown message like it didn't exist, and at first they still came, not as often, not as consistent, but they came, shorter messages, less context, like, "You're still here. It doesn't have to be like this. You're making it harder." But I ignored all of them, completely, no reaction, no acknowledgement, and over time they faded, not suddenly, gradually, less frequent, more spaced out, until eventually they stopped, or at least they haven't come back, not yet, it's been a few months now. Same number, same phone, no messages, no unknown numbers, nothing, and honestly, I don't think about it as much anymore. But every now and then I catch myself hesitating before opening a message from an unknown number, just for a second. Just enough to remember, because whatever that was, it wasn't just random. It had structure, consistency, awareness, and I still don't know what it actually was. A person, multiple people, some kind of system. Something else entirely, I don't know, and I'm not sure I want to, because sometimes understanding something like that doesn't make it less unsettling. It just makes it harder to forget. All I know is this: it didn't stop because I solved it. It stopped because I stepped out of it. And sometimes that's the only way something like that ends. Not with answers. Not with closure, just silence. All right, that one's a bit of a mindbender. The kind of story where the more you try to figure it out, the less clear it becomes. If you're still here, still listening, maybe still playing something in the background, take a second, relax a bit. Let your brain slow down, because the next story is a different kind of unsettling. Less abstract, a little more grounded, but in its own way just as uncomfortable. All right, this one starts simple. Moving into a new place. Nothing unusual, no weird backstory. No, this house has a history type of thing, just a normal move. At least that's how it seemed at the beginning. So this happened about a year ago. I had been living in a small apartment for a while, and I finally decided to move into something bigger. Not a huge house or anything, just a quiet rental on the edge of a neighborhood. One of those places where everything feels a little slower. Less noise, less traffic, more space. Which is exactly what I wanted. The house itself was nice. Not brand new but well kept. 2 floors, small backyard, nothing fancy, but it felt comfortable. Clean. Lived in, but not in a bad way, just settled. The landlord was normal, friendly enough. No weird behavior, no rushed paperwork, everything straightforward. Which, looking back, was probably why I didn't question anything, because nothing gave me a reason to. The first few days were exactly what you'd expect. Unpacking, setting things up, figuring out where everything goes, getting used to the layout, normal stuff, and the house felt fine. No strange noises, no weird smells, no off feeling, just quiet. That kind of quiet that's actually relaxing, at least at first. The first thing I noticed wasn't even strange, just convenient, the lights. Specifically, how I kept forgetting to turn them off. I'd leave a room, come back later, and the lights would be off. At first I assumed I just didn't remember turning them off, which happens, especially when you're distracted. Moving, unpacking, thinking about a dozen things at once, so I ignored it, didn't even think twice, but it kept happening, consistently. Kitchen, living room, hallway. I'd leave a light on, come back later, off. And after a few days it started to feel less like forgetfulness and more like a pattern, so I tested it, deliberately. One evening I turned on the kitchen light, then left the room. Closed the door, waited about 10 minutes, then went back, the light was off. I stood there for a second, because now it wasn't just a vague memory issue. I knew I had left it on. I had just done it, so I checked the switch, normal, nothing unusual, no timer. No smart system, just a standard light switch. At that point I started looking for explanations. Maybe the landlord had installed something, some kind of automated system. So I checked, nothing, no smart home devices, no sensors, nothing connected, just normal wiring. That was the first moment something felt slightly off. Not scary, not even concerning, just unexplainable, and things like that stick with you, even if you don't want them to. The second thing happened a couple days later, and this one was harder to ignore. I had just come back from the store, nothing special. Groceries, a few household items. I walked into the house, set everything down in the kitchen, and went to grab a glass of water. When I came back, the front door was locked. That might not sound strange, except I hadn't locked it. I was sure of that. I had just walked in, set the bags down, no time to lock anything, so I stood there for a second, looking at the door, trying to retrace my steps. Maybe I locked it without thinking. Maybe muscle memory kicked in. That's possible, but something about it didn't feel right, so I unlocked it, opened the door, stepped outside, then came back in again. Slowly, deliberately, left the door unlocked, walked into the kitchen, waited, then went back, still unlocked. So nothing happened that time, which should have been reassuring. Except it was, because now I had 2 things, lights turning off, doors locking. And both of them could be explained, individually, but together they started to form something else. A pattern, not obvious, not clear, but present. Still, I didn't jump to conclusions, because that's how you make situations worse. You start seeing things that aren't there, so I kept living normally, kept going through my routine. Work, food, sleep, nothing unusual, until about a week in when something happened that I couldn't explain at all. I woke up one morning. My phone was on the kitchen counter. That doesn't sound strange, except I always keep it next to my bed. Always same spot, every night, and I remembered putting it there, clearly. So how did it end up in the kitchen? I stood there holding it, trying to figure it out, because now this wasn't a light switch. This wasn't a door, this was something I had physically placed, in a specific location, and it had moved, without me remembering it. And that's when the thought crossed my mind for the first time. Not strongly, not fully formed, just a possibility. What if it's not me? I didn't like that thought, so I pushed it away. Immediately, because there's a line between normal explanations and something else, and I wasn't ready to cross that line yet, so I told myself the simplest answer. I must have moved it. Forgot, that's it, end of story. Except it didn't feel like the end. It felt like the beginning of something I didn't fully understand yet, after the phone thing. I started paying more attention. Not in a paranoid way, just noticing. Because once something happens that you can't fully explain, you either ignore it or you start looking for patterns, and I guess I chose the second one. The next few days were quiet, no big moments, nothing obvious, just small things, subtle ones, the kind you can still explain away if you want to, like doors being slightly more open than I remembered, or cabinets not fully closed, things like that, easy to dismiss. Easy to forget, but they kept happening, and the consistency, that's what made it harder to ignore. One evening I decided to test something again, this time more carefully. I went through the house before bed, checked everything, lights off, doors closed, cabinets shut, and I made a mental note of it, very clearly. Then I went to sleep, nothing unusual, no strange noises, no interruptions, just sleep. When I woke up the next morning, the bathroom light was on. I didn't even react at first. I just stood there in the hallway looking at it, because now, this wasn't something I could brush off easily. I had checked everything, deliberately, right before bed, and I knew that light had been off. So either I had gotten up in the middle of the night, turned it on and gone back to bed without remembering, or something else was going on, and I didn't like either option, because both of them meant I didn't have control over what was happening. Still, I stuck with the first explanation, because it was the only one that made sense, even if it didn't feel right. Maybe I had just been more tired than I realized. Maybe I was moving around in my sleep. People do that, it happens, so I let it go, at least on the surface. But internally something had shifted, because now I wasn't just noticing things, I was anticipating them, waiting for the next moment, the next inconsistency, the next thing that didn't line up, and sure enough. It came 2 days later. This time it wasn't a light or a door, it was the thermostat. I remember this one clearly, because I had set it myself. 72 degrees, that's where I keep it, always, so I walked past it that afternoon, glanced at it out of habit, and it said 68. I stopped, walked back, looked at it again. Not a huge difference, but enough to notice, enough to feel wrong. So I adjusted it back, watched the display change, then I stood there for a second. Just thinking, because now we had something else, not just physical movement, but a system. Something that requires input, deliberate change, and I hadn't done it. At least not that I remembered. I checked the unit, no smart connection, no remote access, no schedule, just manual control, which meant someone had to physically change it. And that thought, that's the one I didn't want to follow, so I just left it, told myself it was probably nothing. Again, but now. That explanation was getting weaker, because the list was getting longer. Lights, doors, phone, thermostat, different things, different systems. Same pattern, something changing without my input. That night I did something different. I didn't just check everything, I documented it, took pictures, phone on the nightstand, lights off, doors closed, thermostat set, everything. So that in the morning I'd have something concrete, something to compare, not just memory, because memory can be unreliable, but pictures. Not so much. I went to sleep, same as before, nothing unusual, no sounds, no interruptions, just quiet. When I woke up, the first thing I did was check my phone, still on the nightstand. Good, then I walked through the house. Slowly, carefully, kitchen, living room, bathroom, everything looked normal until I got to the hallway. One of the doors was open, not wide, just slightly, a few inches, and I stopped, because I knew that door had been closed, not I think, not maybe. I had a picture from the night before, closed and now open. I didn't move right away, I just stood there looking at it, because now this wasn't about memory anymore. This was proof something had changed while I was asleep and I hadn't done it. And for the first time, that thought I had been avoiding came back, stronger, clearer. What if it's not me? And this time, I didn't push it away right away. I just stood there in the hallway looking at that door and realizing something. Whatever was happening, it wasn't random. It was consistent, and it was happening when I wasn't aware. Which meant either I was doing things without remembering or something else was doing them for me, and I didn't know which one was worse. After that door, I couldn't go back to ignoring it, not fully, because now I had something concrete, something I could compare, something that didn't rely on memory, and once you have that, the whole situation changes. So I doubled down, not in a panicked way, just methodical. If something was happening, I was going to figure out how. The next step was obvious. Cameras, not the whole house, just a couple, one in the hallway, one in the living room, nothing complicated, basic setup, motion detection, recording, enough to catch something if there was something to catch. Setting them up felt strange, not because of the act itself, but because of what it implied, that I thought something was happening that I couldn't see. Still, I did it, positioned them carefully, tested the angles, made sure everything was working, then I went through the house again. Same routine, lights off, doors closed, everything in place, and I made sure the cameras were active, recording, then I went to bed. That night, I didn't sleep as well, not because anything happened, but because I was aware. Waiting even if I didn't want to be. Every small sound felt louder, every shift in the house more noticeable, but nothing actually happened. At least not that I heard. When I woke up, the first thing I did wasn't checking the house, it was checking the footage. I opened the app, scrolled back to the night, and started watching. At first, nothing, just empty rooms, still frames, no movement, no changes, exactly what you'd expect, and for a moment that felt like relief. Like maybe everything had been in my head, maybe the cameras would confirm that, but then about halfway through the timeline there was motion. Not in the hallway, not where I expected. In the living room, I tapped the clip, watched it. At first it didn't look like anything, just the room, dark, quiet, then something shifted. Subtle, the light in the corners flickered, not on, not off, just flickered, and then the lamp turned on. I leaned forward slightly, because that shouldn't happen, not by itself. There was no timer, no smart system, no remote, just a standard lamp, and it had turned on its own. I watched the clip again, slower this time, looking for something I missed, a shadow, a movement, anything, nothing, just the light turning on with no visible cause. I sat there for a minute because now this wasn't about memory. This wasn't about forgetting things. This was recorded, visible, real, and I didn't know what to do with that. Still, I kept watching, scrolled further. Another clip. This one from the hallway, short, only a few seconds. At first, nothing. Then the door, the same one from before, it moved, not quickly, not dramatically. Slowly, just opening a few inches, then stopping, no one there, no hand, no shadow, just movement. I replayed it again and again, trying to find something, anything that explained it. There was, and that's when the feeling changed. Not curiosity, not confusion, something else, because now there was no simple explanation left. This wasn't me forgetting, this wasn't coincidence. This was something happening without a visible cause, and I didn't know how to process that. I didn't panic, not immediately. I just sat there, watching the clips over and over, trying to make them make sense. They didn't, because they weren't supposed to, at least not in a normal way. That's when I realized something else. The timing, both clips happened while I was asleep, which means whatever this was, it wasn't random. It had a pattern, a window, a routine, and that's when a new thought formed, one I hadn't considered before, not just what is happening, but why only when I'm not aware? Because if something is happening consistently at specific times, there's a reason. There's always a reason. And at that point, I wasn't sure I wanted to find out what it was, but I knew one thing. I couldn't ignore it anymore, because now it wasn't just a feeling. It was something I had seen, recorded, confirmed, and once you reach that point, there's no going back to normal, only forward into whatever comes next. After seeing that footage, I didn't sleep normally again. Not right away, because once something like that is confirmed, your brain doesn't just go back to this is fine. It shifts, everything feels slightly different. The house didn't look different, didn't sound different, but it felt different, like there was something happening just outside of what I could see. Still, I didn't jump to conclusions. I needed more data. More confirmation, so I kept the cameras running, every night, same setup, same routine, lights off, doors closed, everything documented. And every morning I checked the footage. At first it was consistent, small things, lights turning on, doors opening slightly, nothing extreme, nothing dramatic, but always something, and always during the same window. Between about 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. that was the pattern, every time, which made it feel less random, more scheduled. And that's what made it unsettling, because random things are easier to dismiss. Patterns mean intention, or at least consistency. After a few nights of that, I noticed something else. Not just what was happening, but how much was happening. It wasn't a lot, just 1 or 2 changes per night, never everything at once, never chaotic, just small adjustments. Like someone was moving through the house carefully, deliberately, not to make a mess, not to cause damage, just to change things. That detail stuck with me, because if something wanted to be disruptive, it could be, but this was controlled, almost subtle, like it didn't want to be noticed, or maybe it didn't care if it was. Around the end of that week, I decided to do something I had been avoiding. I stayed awake, not all night, just long enough to cover that window. 2 a.m. to 4 a.m. I set everything up like usual. Lights off, doors closed, cameras recording, then I sat in the living room. In the dark, waiting, and that wait was the longest part, because nothing happened right away. The house was quiet, completely still. The kind of quiet you only notice when you're actively listening for something. Minutes passed, then an hour, nothing, which almost felt reassuring. Like maybe it only happened when I was asleep. Maybe it was something I was doing unconsciously, and being awake would stop it. That thought gave me a small sense of control. Until around 2:47 a.m. I heard it. A sound, not loud, not sharp, just a click from somewhere in the house. I didn't move, didn't react, just listened. A few seconds passed, then another sound, softer, like something shifting. I stood up slowly, heart steady, not racing, just focused. Because at that point I wasn't scared, I was trying to understand. I walked toward the hallway, step by step, listening, watching. The house was still dark, still quiet, until I reached the doorway. And saw it, the bathroom light turning on. not flickering, not snapping, just slowly illuminating like a normal switch had been flipped. Except there was no one there. I stood there watching it happen, fully awake, fully aware, no cameras, no screens, just real, and that's when it changed, because before everything had been indirect, footage after the fact. Now it was happening in front of me and there was no explanation, no movement, no cause, just the effect. I didn't step closer. I didn't turn it off, I just stood there, watching, waiting for something else. Nothing came, the light stayed on, the house stayed quiet like whatever had happened was complete. After a minute or two I stepped forward, reached for the switch, turned it off, normal, nothing unusual, and that's what made it worse. Because everything about the result was normal, it was the cause that was. I went back to the living room, sat down, didn't sleep, just waited, until morning, and when the sun came up. Everything looked the same again. Quiet still, normal, except now I knew, for sure, it wasn't just happening when I was unaware, it was happening, period. And the only difference was whether I saw it or not, and once you see something like that you can't unsee it, you can't go back to maybe, you can't go back to probably nothing, because now it's real. And the only question left is, what do you do with that? After that night, I stopped trying to explain it. Not because I didn't want answers, but because every explanation I came up with didn't hold. So instead of asking what it was, I started focusing on something else. How it behaved, because whatever was happening, it followed rules, patterns, consistency, and that's something you can work with. The first thing I tested was timing. I stayed up again the next night. Same setup, same window, 2 a.m. to 4 a.m., but this time I changed my position. Instead of sitting in the living room, I stayed in my bedroom, door open, lights off, just watching from a different angle. Nothing happened at first, same as before, quiet, still. Then around 3:10 I heard it again, that soft click. Same as the previous night, except this time it didn't come from the bathroom, it came from the kitchen. I didn't move right away, I just listened, because now I knew it was happening, whether I approached it or not. A few seconds passed. Then the faint sound of something shifting, like a cabinet door, slow, controlled, and that's when I realized something. It wasn't random movement, it was selective, different areas, different objects, but always one at a time. I got up slowly, walked toward the kitchen, and when I reached the doorway, everything was still. No movement, no sound, just the cabinet slightly open. A few inches, same pattern, same precision. I stepped closer, looked inside, nothing missing, nothing out of place. Just open. I closed it, stood there for a moment, then went back to the bedroom, and that's when it clicked. It wasn't reacting to where I was, it was continuing its pattern regardless, which meant it wasn't avoiding me. It also wasn't engaging with me, it was just doing what it did. That made it feel different. Less like something targeting me and more like something operating independently. Still unsettling, but in a different way. The next few nights I tested more, stayed awake, moved around, changed routines. Sometimes in the living room, sometimes in the bedroom, sometimes walking through the house during that window, and every time something happened. A light, a door, a cabinet, the thermostat once. Always small, always controlled, always consistent, and one thing became clear, it didn't stop when I was awake, it just didn't acknowledge me. That's the best way I can describe it. It didn't react, didn't adjust, didn't avoid, it just continued, like I wasn't part of the equation, and for some reason that felt worse, because it meant whatever this was wasn't aware of me in the way I expected, or if it was, it didn't care. That thought stayed with me. Because it shifted the entire context. This wasn't something happening to me, it was something happening around me, and I just happened to be there. The next thing I tested was disruption, not just changing where I was, but changing the environment. One night before bed I left everything open. Cabinets, doors, lights on, everything completely different from the usual setup. Then I went to sleep. When I woke up, everything was closed, lights off, doors shut, cabinets back in place. Exactly how I would normally leave them, and I just stood there looking at it, because now it wasn't just repeating actions. It was restoring, returning things to a state, a specific one, and that state matched my routine, not random, not neutral. Mine, that's when the title thought formed, not in words, just a realization. It knows the pattern, not in a conscious way, not like a person, but in a functional way, like it recognizes the structure and maintains it. And that's when it became something else entirely, because now it wasn't just movement, it was consistency, alignment, with me, and I didn't know what that meant or why it was happening, but I knew one thing, this wasn't going to stop on its own because it wasn't random. It was part of something that had already been there before I even moved in, and I had just stepped into it. After I realized it was restoring things, not just moving them, everything felt different again. Because now it wasn't just activity, it was intention, not in a human sense but in a structured one. There was a correct state, and whatever this was, it was maintaining it, and the strangest part, that correct state matched my routine, not the house's original setup, not something neutral. Mine. Which raised a question I couldn't ignore anymore. How did it know? Because I hadn't lived there long. A couple of weeks. That's not enough time for something to learn patterns. It's not in a normal way, but the consistency was there. Lights off at night, doors closed, thermostat set, phone on the nightstand, everything aligned, so I decided to test that directly. Instead of just disrupting things randomly, I changed my routine completely, on purpose. That night I did everything differently, left lights on in places I normally wouldn't, moved objects around, put my phone in the kitchen, left doors open, changed the thermostat, everything. Then I stayed awake, watched. Around 2:30 it started, the same way as always, subtle, quiet, a click, then movement, but this time it was faster, not rushed, just more frequent, like it had more to correct, more to adjust. I watched from the hallway as the kitchen light turned off. Then a few minutes later, a cabinet closed, then another, then the thermostat changed, back to my usual setting, and I just stood there watching it happen, piece by piece, like something was going through a checklist, restoring everything to what it expected. And the part that stayed with me the most was how precise it was. Nothing extra, nothing random, just the exact changes needed, no more, no less. And that's when it stopped feeling like coincidence entirely, because coincidence doesn't operate like that. This was systematic, and systems don't just exist without purpose, even if you don't understand that purpose. After that night, I stopped trying to interrupt it, because it didn't matter. It would just adjust, adapt, restore. So instead, I tried something else. I left things exactly how I normally would, perfectly aligned with my routine. Lights off, doors closed, everything in place, and I stayed awake, watching, waiting, and for the first time nothing happened, no clicks, no movement, no changes, just stillness, complete. And that's when I understood something. It wasn't acting randomly. It was acting when something was out of place. When the environment didn't match the expected state, it corrected it. But when everything was already aligned, there was nothing to do, so it didn't. That should have been reassuring, in a way, but it was, because it meant this wasn't about me being there. It was about the state of the house, and I just happened to match it. Which raises a bigger question. What was the original state, before me, before my routine? Because if it was matching mine now, what had it been matching before? That thought stuck because it implied something else. This didn't start with me, I had just become part of it, and that's when I realized something I hadn't considered before. Maybe this wasn't something I needed to stop. Maybe it was something that would continue with or without me, and that changes things, because if something isn't dependent on you, you don't control it, you just exist alongside it. For a while I tried to live with that, keep things normal, stay within the pattern, let it do whatever it was doing, and honestly it worked. No more unexpected changes. No more surprises. As long as I stayed consistent, everything stayed quiet, but that came with a cost. Because now I was adjusting my behavior to avoid triggering something I didn't understand, and that's not a comfortable way to live, even if nothing bad is happening. So after a few days of that, I started thinking about leaving. Not immediately, not out of fear, just practically, because whatever this was, it wasn't something I wanted to deal with long term. Not like this. Not without understanding it, and I had a feeling understanding it wouldn't make it easier, it would just make it more real. So I started looking at other places, casually, nothing urgent, but enough to know I had options. Because at that point, I wasn't trying to solve it anymore, I was just trying to step out of it, and sometimes that's the only solution you have. Once I started thinking about leaving, the whole situation shifted again. Not externally, nothing about the house changed. But internally, I stopped treating it like something I had to manage, and started treating it like something I was just passing through, and that made it easier, in a strange way, because I wasn't trying to control it anymore. I was just observing, finishing out my time there, keeping things consistent, avoiding unnecessary disruptions, and for a while everything stayed quiet, no unexpected movements, no late-night changes. As long as I kept things aligned, it didn't do anything. Which confirmed what I already suspected. It wasn't active all the time, it was reactive, triggered by deviation, correcting back to a baseline, and I had learned how to stay within that baseline, but that didn't mean I understood it, or that I was comfortable with it. Because knowing how to avoid something is not the same as being okay with it. A few days before I was supposed to move out, something happened that I didn't expect, not because it was dramatic, but because it broke the pattern. Up until that point, everything had been consistent, predictable. If I left things correct, nothing happened. If I changed something, it would be restored, simple, reliable, but that night, I didn't change anything. Everything was exactly how it should be. Lights off, doors closed. Everything aligned, and I stayed awake, not because I was testing anything, just couldn't sleep. Around 3 a.m. I heard it, that familiar click, and I froze because that wasn't supposed to happen. Not when everything was already in place. I didn't move right away, I just listened. Another sound, soft from the hallway, then silence. I stood up slowly, walked toward the sound, and when I reached the hallway, everything looked normal. Nothing open, nothing out of place, but something felt off. Not visually, just in the air, hard to explain, like something had happened but left no trace. I checked the rooms. One by one, everything looked exactly as I had left it, until I got to the bedroom, and saw it, my phone not on the nightstand, on the floor right next to the bed. I stopped because that didn't fit the pattern at all. This wasn't restoring, this wasn't aligning. This was movement without correction, something different. I picked it up, looked at it, nothing unusual. No notifications, no signs of anything, just moved, and that's when the thought hit me. For the first time since this started, this wasn't about maintaining a pattern. This was something else, something outside of the usual behavior, and that made it more unsettling than anything before, because consistency, even strange consistency, is something you can adapt to. But when something breaks its own pattern, you lose that sense of predictability, and that's where things get uncomfortable. I didn't stay up much longer after that. I went back to bed, put the phone back where it belonged, and just waited for morning. And when morning came, everything was normal again, like nothing had happened, but I knew it had, and I knew one more thing. Whatever this was, it wasn't fixed, it wasn't limited, and it wasn't fully predictable, which meant leaving wasn't just a good idea anymore. It was the only one that made sense. After that night, I didn't wait. I moved up my timeline. Packed everything faster, didn't overthink it, didn't try to test anything else, because at that point, I had enough, not answers, but enough information to know I didn't want to stay. The last couple of days in that house were quiet, no activity, no changes, no sounds, everything stayed exactly as I left it, which strangely felt intentional, like whatever had been happening had stopped, or maybe didn't need to happen anymore, because I wasn't changing anything, I wasn't disrupting the pattern. I was just leaving, and maybe that was enough. On the final night, I did one last check, not because I expected anything, just habit at that point, walked through the house. Lights off, doors closed, everything in place. Then I stood in the hallway for a second, just looking, because for the past few weeks, this space had been something else entirely, not just a house, something structured, something consistent, something I didn't fully understand, and now it was just a house again. Quiet, still. Normal, or at least it looked that way. I went to sleep, no disturbances, no sounds, nothing. When I woke up the next morning, everything was exactly how I left it. No changes, no movement, just stillness. I packed the last of my things, loaded everything into the car, and before I left, I went back inside one more time, not for any practical reason, just to look. The house was empty now, no furniture, no personal items, just walls, floors, space, and for a moment, it felt different again. Not active, not moving, just empty, like whatever had been happening was tied to something, a routine, a presence, a pattern. And without that, there was nothing left to do. I didn't stay long, just a few seconds, then I walked out, closed the door, locked it, and left. The new place was normal, nothing strange, nothing unusual, just a regular apartment, noise from neighbors, inconsistent schedules, lights left on, doors half open. All the little imperfections that used to be annoying now felt reassuring, because they were human, unpredictable, real, and that's what had been missing. The house wasn't chaotic, it wasn't broken. It was too consistent, too aligned, too controlled, and that's what made it feel wrong. Not because something bad was happening, but because something was maintaining a state without a visible cause. I still think about it sometimes. Not often, but every now and then. Especially when I leave a room and forget to turn off the light, or when I notice something slightly out of place. And for a split second there, that thought, what if it fixes itself? Of course it never does, nothing happens, everything stays exactly as I left it, because that's how it's supposed to be. But that small hesitation, that moment of expectation, that's the part that stayed with me. Not fear, not confusion, just awareness, because whatever that was, it wasn't random. It had structure. Consistency. And it operated whether I understood it or not. I never found out what caused it, never got an explanation, never went back, and honestly, I don't think I want one. Because some things are easier to leave behind as they are, unexplained, unresolved, just something that happened, and something you chose to step away from. Alright, that one's more grounded, but in a different way. No obvious threat, no direct confrontation, just something that doesn't quite behave the way it should. And sometimes that's worse. Take a moment, relax, maybe adjust your position, grab some water, because the next one is a little more personal, a little more direct, and in its own way just as unsettling. Alright, last story for this session, and this one feels normal at first, almost boring, until it very much is. So this happened not that long ago, maybe 6 months back. I had just started going to a new gym, nothing special, just needed a change of environment. Different schedule, different people, that kind of thing. The gym itself was pretty standard, not too crowded, good equipment, a mix of regulars and new people, exactly what you'd expect. And for the first couple of weeks, everything was normal. Go in, do my workout, leave, no real interactions, just the usual nods, maybe a quick hey here and there, nothing memorable. Then one day someone talked to me, not unusual, happens all the time in places like that. Quick question about a machine, maybe some small talk, except this wasn't that. I was finishing up a set when this guy walked over, around my age, normal looking, nothing that stood out, and he said, "Hey, you switched to mornings." I paused for a second because of how he said it, not as a question, as a statement, like he already knew, so I nodded. "Yeah, just works better for me now." He smiled slightly. Figured, and then just stood there like he was waiting for something. So I added, "Have we met?" because I didn't recognize him at all. He shook his head. "Not really." That phrasing, that's what caught me. Not really, not no, not I don't think so. Just not really. I let it go because maybe he had seen me around. Maybe he noticed my schedule change. That's normal. People observe things, especially in places like gyms where routines repeat, so I didn't think much of it. We talked for maybe a minute, nothing deep, just basic stuff. Workouts, schedules, nothing personal. Then he left, and that should have been the end of it. Except the next day he was there again, same time as me. Which again isn't weird, people have routines. But this time he walked over almost immediately, like he had been waiting, and he said, "You didn't stay as long yesterday." I blinked, because now that was more specific, not just noticing I was there, but how long I stayed, so I shrugged. "Yeah, had to leave early," he nodded. "Yeah, I figured something came up." Again, not a question, a conclusion, and that's when I started paying attention. Because noticing someone's schedule, that's normal. Tracking small variations in it, that's different. Still, I didn't react, I just kept it casual. "Yeah, just busy," he smiled again, same way as before. Then said, "You usually finish with cardio, right?" I paused for a second, because that was accurate, but also specific, something you'd only know if you had been watching more than just casually. So I asked, "You've been coming here long?" He shrugged. "A while," that was it, no detail, no follow-up, just enough to answer the question without actually answering it, and at that point something felt slightly off, not dangerous, not even uncomfortable yet, just noticeable. Like the conversation wasn't balanced, like he knew more than I did, and I didn't know why. We talked for another minute or two, then I moved on, finished my workout, left, and on the way home I thought about it, not obsessively, just casually, because it stood out, but it didn't feel like a problem, not yet, it just felt like a slightly weird interaction. Something you'd normally forget after a day or two, except I didn't forget it, because the next time I saw him, he knew something else, something I hadn't told anyone at that gym, and that's when it stopped feeling casual. The next time I saw him, it was 2 days later. Same time, same routine, nothing different on my end, but the moment I walked in I saw him, already there, already looking in my direction, not staring, just aware, like he had been expecting me. Again, not unusual on its own, people notice patterns, especially if they come at the same time every day. But combined with everything else, it started to feel deliberate. I got through my first couple exercises without interacting, kept to myself. Focused, but I could feel it, that awareness, not constant, not obvious, just present. Then about halfway through my workout, he came over again. Same casual approach, same neutral expression, and he said, "You switched your routine." I looked at him, because that was true, but it had only been that day. I had decided to change things up a bit. Different order, different exercises. Nothing dramatic, but still new. So I asked, "How would you know that?" I kept my tone light, not confrontational, just curious. He shrugged slightly. "I pay attention." Simple answer, too simple, because paying attention doesn't explain noticing a change within the same day, unless you're watching closely. Closer than normal, I nodded slowly, didn't push it, because at that point, I wasn't sure what I was dealing with, and pushing too hard too early doesn't usually help, so I just said, "Yeah, trying something different." He nodded, like that confirmed something for him, then added, "You'll go back to the old one." Again, not a suggestion, not a guess, a statement. I half smiled. "Maybe." He looked at me for a second, then said, "You always do." That line stuck because of the word always, like there was a pattern, a history, something repeatable. Except I had never talked to him about my routines before. So where was that coming from? I didn't respond to that part, I just moved on, finished my set, switched machines, and for a while he left me alone. Which gave me time to think, because now this wasn't just casual observation. This was familiarity without explanation, and that's what made it uncomfortable. Not what he was saying, but how confidently he was saying it, like he already knew how things would go. Later in the workout, I saw him again, across the room this time. Talking to someone else, normal conversation, nothing strange, and for a second that grounded it, made it feel more normal, like maybe I was overthinking it. Maybe he was just observant, maybe he just had a good memory. That happens. Some people notice patterns better than others. But then as I was leaving, he said something that didn't fit that explanation. I was grabbing my stuff, heading toward the exit, and as I passed by him, he said, "Don't skip tomorrow." I stopped, turned slightly. "Why would I skip tomorrow?" He shrugged. "Just saying," then looked away, like the conversation was over, and I stood there for a second, because that wasn't based on anything. I hadn't mentioned skipping, hadn't hinted at it, nothing. So that wasn't observation, that was assumption or prediction or something else entirely. I didn't respond, I just left, and the whole way home that line stayed in my head, "Don't skip tomorrow." Because it wasn't what he said, it was how he said it, like it mattered. Like it wasn't just a random comment. That night I thought about not going just to see, just to test it, but I didn't, because I didn't want to change my behavior based on someone else's words, especially when I didn't understand them, so I went. Same time, same routine, and when I walked in he was already there, of course, and he looked at me, nodded slightly and said, "Good, that was it, just good." Like something had been confirmed, and at that point it stopped feeling like coincidence entirely. Because now it wasn't just that he knew things, it was that he expected things, and those expectations were lining up, and I didn't know how or why, but I knew one thing, this wasn't going to stay small, because patterns like that don't just disappear, they build, and I was starting to feel like I was already part of something I hadn't agreed to. After that good, I stopped brushing it off. Before I could still tell myself it was coincidence, that he was just observant, that I was reading too much into normal interactions. But now there was a pattern, and it was consistent, so instead of ignoring it I decided to test it, not directly, just subtly. That day I changed my routine again, on purpose, different exercises, different order, even switched the time slightly, came in about 30 minutes earlier than usual, not a huge change. But enough to break any predictable pattern. When I walked in, he wasn't there. Which, for a second, felt like confirmation, like maybe everything really had been coincidence. Maybe I had just aligned with his schedule before, and now that I changed mine, that connection was gone. I almost relaxed, started my workout, focused, didn't think about it. Until about 20 minutes in, he walked in, and immediately looked around, not casually, specifically, like he was searching. And when his eyes landed on me, he didn't look surprised. He just nodded, like he had found what he was looking for, then walked over. Earlier today, again not a question, a statement. I nodded. Yeah, had some extra time. He tilted his head slightly. Temporary. I frowned a little. What do you mean? He shrugged. You won't keep this schedule. Same tone, same certainty, and that's when I decided to push a little. Why do you keep saying things like that? Not aggressive, just direct. He didn't react immediately, just looked at me for a second. Then said, because you follow patterns. That answer wasn't wrong. Everyone follows patterns, routines, habits, but the way he said it, it felt more specific than that, like he wasn't talking about people in general, he was talking about me. So I asked, based on what? He smiled slightly, not amused, not friendly, just acknowledging the question. Time. That was it, just one word, and it didn't clarify anything. It just made everything feel more layered, like there was context missing. Context he had, and I didn't respond to that because I didn't know how, so I just continued my workout. And this time I was more aware, not just of him, of everything, where he was, what he was doing, and I noticed something. He wasn't watching me constantly, he wasn't hovering, he just checked in at specific moments, like he knew when to look, which is a strange thing to notice. Because it's not obvious, it's not something you see right away, but once you notice it, it's hard to ignore. Later that session I finished earlier than usual. On purpose, just to see what would happen, I packed up my stuff, started heading out, and as I passed him he said, "You'll be back later." I stopped, turned. "No, I won't." I said it clearly because I knew I had plans, I wasn't coming back that day at all. He nodded slowly. "Not today," then looked at me. "You will." That didn't make sense, so I asked, "What are you talking about?" He didn't answer. Just looked at me for a second longer, then went back to what he was doing, like the conversation was over, and I stood there for just a second before leaving, because now it wasn't just about routines. It was about statements that didn't align with reality, not immediately at least, and that's what made it different, because before everything he said was based on something observable. My schedule, my habits, my patterns. Now he was saying things that extended beyond that, things that hadn't happened yet, and I didn't know how to process that. I left the gym, went about my day, did everything I had planned, didn't go back, didn't even think about it for a while, until later that night, around 9 p.m. I got a notification from the gym's app, one I rarely used, just for check-ins. It said, "Session recorded." I frowned because I hadn't been there, not since the morning, so I opened the app. Checked the logs, and there it was. A check-in, at 8:42 p.m. under my account, and that's when I felt it. Not confusion, not curiosity, something else, because now it wasn't just what he said. It was that something had matched it, and I hadn't been part of it, at least not consciously, and that's when the situation changed, from strange to something I couldn't ignore anymore. When I saw that check-in, I didn't react right away, I just stared at it. Because there are only a few explanations for something like that. Either the system glitched, or someone else used my account, or something I didn't understand was happening. I went with the simplest one first. Glitch, apps mess up sometimes. Logs get duplicated, timing errors happen, so I refreshed it, closed the app, opened it again, still there, same timestamp, same entry, 8:42 p.m. Then I checked something else, the location history, because the gym app logs that too. And according to it, the check-in happened at the actual location. Not remotely, not a system error, a physical entry, which didn't make sense because I hadn't been there, not even close. So I did the next logical thing. I checked my key tag, the one you scan to get in, still in my pocket, hadn't left me all day, which meant no one should have been able to use it, at least not physically. That's when the thought crossed my mind, not fully formed, just a possibility. What if it wasn't the tag? Some gyms have mobile check-ins, apps, QR codes, things like that, so I checked. Yes, the app could generate a code, but it required authentication. My account, my login, which meant if someone had used it, they would need access, and I hadn't given that to anyone, at least not knowingly. I sat there for a minute, phone in hand, thinking, because now this wasn't just about what he said. This was about something actually happening that aligned with it, and that's what made it different. So I did something I probably should have done earlier. I changed my password, immediately logged out of all devices, reset everything, basic security steps, just to eliminate that possibility. Then I waited, didn't go back to the gym that night, didn't check anything else, just let it sit. The next morning I went in again, same time, same routine, but this time I was paying attention in a different way, not just to him, to everything. When I walked in he was there, of course, and as soon as he saw me he said, "You didn't stay long." I stopped because now that didn't fit at all. "I wasn't here last night." I said it clearly, directly. He tilted his head slightly. You left early, not a correction, a reinterpretation, like he was adjusting the statement to fit, but still keeping the core idea, which was I had been there and I hadn't. So I pushed, no, I didn't come at all. This time he paused, longer than usual, then said, then why did you check in? And that's when everything locked into place. Because that wasn't a guess, that wasn't observation, that was knowledge, specific, accurate, about something that shouldn't have happened. I looked at him, really looked, trying to read something. Anything, there was nothing, no reaction, no confusion, just calm, like this was normal, like the question made sense. So I asked, how do you know that? And for the first time he didn't answer immediately. He just looked at me for a few seconds, then said, you were here, and that was it, no explanation, no elaboration, just certainty, and that's when I realized something. This wasn't about him guessing, or observing, or even tracking patterns. This was something else, because now there was information involved. Information I didn't have, but he did, and I didn't know where it was coming from. I didn't argue, didn't try to correct him again, because it wasn't going anywhere. So I just said, no I was, and walked away, finished my workout. Left, but this time I didn't let it go, because now there was something tangible, something verifiable, something that had happened outside of what I knew, and it matched what he said, and that's the kind of thing you don't ignore, because it's not just weird, it's real, and I needed to figure out how. After that conversation, I stopped treating it like coincidence entirely, because at that point there were too many things lining up too precisely, so instead of reacting I started testing. Not him directly, the situation, the system. That same day I went home and checked everything again. Gym app, login history, devices, nothing unusual, no unknown logins, no extra sessions, no signs that anyone else had accessed my account, except for that one thing, the check-in, which was still there, still recorded, still real. So I decided to test it again. Deliberately. That night I stayed home, didn't go anywhere, didn't open the gym app, didn't interact with anything related to it, just normal evening. And around the same time as before I checked the app. Nothing, no check-in, which was expected, but also important, because it meant whatever happened the night before wasn't automatic, it wasn't a recurring glitch, it was specific, triggered, or intentional. The next day at the gym, he approached me again. Same as always, no hesitation, no build-up. You didn't come back, I nodded. Yeah, I told you I wouldn't. He looked at me for a second, then said, you said that yesterday too. That stopped me because now he was referencing a pattern that didn't exist, at least not from my perspective. So I asked when. He didn't answer right away, just thought then, before. That word again, before, like there was a timeline I wasn't aware of, like there were events that had happened that I didn't remember, and that's when the thought came back, stronger this time. What if this isn't just him? Because up until that point, I had been focusing on him as the source, the one noticing things, the one saying things, but what if he was just part of it, not the cause, just connected to whatever was happening? That idea didn't make things clearer, but it shifted the perspective. So instead of questioning him, I started asking different kinds of questions, indirect ones. What time do you usually come here? He shrugged. Whenever I need to. Vague, non-specific, same as before, so I asked, do you come at night too? He looked at me, slightly longer than usual, then said, sometimes. Again, no detail, no clarity, just enough to respond, but not enough to understand, and that was consistent across everything. He never gave full answers, just partial ones, like he was avoiding specifics, or like specifics didn't matter. Later that workout, I tried something else. I changed my routine again. Different exercises, different order, but this time I watched his reaction, not directly, just peripherally, and I noticed something. He didn't respond immediately, not like before. He waited, observed, then after a few minutes he came over and said, you'll switch back. Same line as before, same certainty, and that's when I realized something. It didn't matter what I did in the moment. He wasn't reacting to the change itself. He was reacting to the pattern, the expectation of what would happen next, and that's a very different thing, because it means he wasn't just observing behavior, he was anticipating it based on something I didn't have access to. After that session, I made another decision. I wasn't going to go back for a few days, not because I was avoiding him, but because I wanted to break the pattern completely. No routine, no schedule, no consistency, just absence, and see what happened. So I didn't go for 3 days. No gym, no check-ins, nothing, and for those 3 days everything felt normal again. No strange interactions, no weird statements, no patterns being referenced, just quiet, which honestly felt good, like stepping out of something without fully realizing you were in it. But on the 4th day I went back, same time as before, and when I walked in he was there, of course, and he looked at me like I had just returned to something, not just a place. And he said, you took longer this time, not you weren't here, not where have you been, just you took longer. Like the absence was part of the pattern too, and that's when I knew. This wasn't going to resolve on its own, because whatever this was, it wasn't based on presence. It was based on continuity, and I had already been included in it. Whether I wanted to be or not, after that I stopped trying to break the pattern because it didn't matter. Presence, absence, changes, everything still fit into whatever this was, so instead I tried something different. I stopped reacting to him completely, no questions, no engagement, just normal interaction, short responses, then back to my workout. because at that point, every time I pushed, it didn't give me answers. It just reinforced the pattern, and I wanted to see what happened. If I didn't feed into it, the first couple days nothing changed. He still approached, still made those statements, still referenced things like they were part of something ongoing, but I didn't engage, didn't question, didn't follow up, and slowly his behavior shifted, not dramatically, just less direct, shorter comments, less frequent, like "you're early, you're finishing soon." Same order, still accurate, still specific, but without the deeper implications. Without the "you always do this" kind of phrasing, and that was interesting because it suggested something, that the interaction itself was part of what kept it going, not the cause but a component, and removing that changed how it behaved, not stopped it, just altered it. Around that time I noticed something else. The check-ins, they stopped, no more random entries, no more unexplained logs, everything matched exactly what I did, which should have been reassuring, and it was, at least partially. Because it meant whatever had happened before wasn't continuing, but it also raised another question. Why had it stopped? Was it because I changed my password? Because I stopped going at certain times? Because I stopped engaging? Or because something had adjusted? I didn't know, and I wasn't sure I wanted to, so I kept things simple, routine, consistent, minimal interaction, and for a while everything stabilized. No new strange events, no escalation, just that underlying awareness. That he still knew things, still anticipated things, just didn't say as much anymore. Until one day he said something different, something that didn't fit the pattern. I was finishing up, getting ready to leave, and as I walked past him he said, "You're almost done." I stopped, because that wasn't about the workout, not in the way he said it, it sounded broader. So I asked, "What do you mean?" He looked at me, for a second longer than usual, then said, "Here, just that. You're almost done here," and I felt that one because it lined up, not with my routine, but with something else. I had already been thinking about switching gyms, not because of him. Just timing, new schedule, new location, it made sense, but I hadn't told anyone, not at the gym, not anywhere, so I asked, "How would you know that?" Same question as before, but this time I already knew the answer wouldn't be clear. He didn't respond immediately, then, "You're already moving on." Again, not a guess, a statement, and that's when it clicked, not fully, but enough. It wasn't that he knew specific events. It was that he tracked direction, patterns over time, changes in behavior, subtle shifts, and used those to project forward, which is something people can do to a degree, but this felt sharper than that, more precise, more certain, and I didn't know where that line was between observation and something else. I didn't respond, I just nodded slightly, and left. On the way home, I made a decision. Not based on fear, not based on confusion, just clarity. I was done, not just for the day, for good, because whatever this was, whether it was just an extremely observant person or something more layered, it wasn't something I wanted to keep being part of. Not when I didn't understand it, not when it felt like I was being tracked in ways I couldn't see. So I stopped going, completely. No more gym, no more routine there, no more interaction. And for a while, that was it. Nothing followed, nothing continued, just absence, which felt like relief, until about a week later when I saw him somewhere else. And that's when I realized it hadn't been tied to the gym at all. A week after I stopped going to the gym, I wasn't thinking about it anymore, not actively. It had faded into the background, like most strange things do once they stop happening. I had a new routine, different schedule, different places. Everything felt normal again. Then one afternoon I saw him, not at the gym, at a grocery store across the aisle, just standing there, looking at something on a shelf. And for a second I thought I was mistaken, because context changes everything. Seeing someone in a different place makes them feel like a different person. But then he looked up, saw me, and nodded, same as always, same expression, same awareness, and that's when I knew it wasn't tied to the gym. At all. I didn't approach him. Didn't say anything, I just kept walking. Grabbed what I needed, tried to act normal, but that feeling, that awareness, it came back immediately, because now there was no shared context. No routine, no pattern, at least not one I could see, and yet there he was, same as before. When I got to the checkout, he was already there, of course, standing a couple people ahead, and when he finished, he stepped aside. Waited, not in an obvious way, just didn't leave immediately. And when I walked past him, he said, "You changed it." I stopped, because now there was no ambiguity, no overlap, no shared routine. So I asked, "What?" He looked at me. "You don't go there anymore." Not a question, a statement, again, and I felt that same thing, that quiet realization that, whatever this was, it wasn't limited, not by place, not by schedule. So I said, "Yeah, I switched." Kept it simple, neutral. He nodded. "Better," then looked at me for a second longer. "You'll keep this one." That line felt familiar, same structure, same certainty, different context, and that's when I realized something. It didn't matter where I was or what I changed. The pattern continued, because it wasn't tied to the environment, it was tied to me, not in a personal way, not like he knew me, but like I was part of something, a sequence, a set of behaviors, and he was just observing it, or tracking it, or something close to that. I didn't respond. I just nodded slightly, and kept walking, left the store, went home, and sat there for a while, because now it wasn't just uncomfortable, it was clear. This wasn't going to stop on its own, because it wasn't reactive. It was continuous, and I had already been included in it, so I made one final decision. I wasn't going to engage at all, not just at the gym. Not just in specific places. Anywhere, if I saw him again, I wouldn't respond, wouldn't acknowledge, wouldn't participate, because at this point, participation felt like the only thing keeping it active, and I wanted to see what happened without it. Because sometimes the only way to understand something like this is to remove yourself from it completely and see if it still continues or if it fades. And honestly, I wasn't sure which one I was hopping for. After that day, I stuck to that decision. No engagement, no acknowledgement, nothing. If I saw him, I treated him like he wasn't there. Not out of fear, not out of anger. Just intentionally stepping out of whatever this was, and for a while it worked. I didn't see him again, not at the store, not anywhere, and slowly that tension faded. That constant awareness went away. My routine settled into something new, different places, different people. Everything felt normal again, and after a couple weeks, I stopped thinking about it entirely. It became one of those things that happened and then didn't. Until one day it came back, not directly, not in person, in a way I didn't expect. I was going through my phone, cleaning up old notes, messages, random stuff, and I found something, a note, untitled, no timestamp, just text. I opened it, and for a second I didn't understand what I was looking at because it wasn't something I remembered writing at all. It was a list. Short, simple. Like this: morning right arrow, consistent, midday right arrow, variable, evening right arrow, unstable, adjustment phase, ongoing. I stared at it. Because that wasn't how I write. Not the format, not the wording, not anything. And there was nothing else in the note, no context, no explanation, just that. So I checked the details, no creation date, no edit history. Nothing, like it had just appeared, which shouldn't be possible. But at this point, shouldn't be possible didn't carry much weight anymore. I closed it, opened it again. Same thing, still there, unchanged, and that's when I felt it again. Not fear, just that same awareness. Because that language, that structure, it felt familiar. Not from something I had written, from something I had heard, the way he talked, short statements, pattern-based, observational, like he was describing something from the outside. And that's when the realization hit, not suddenly, just quietly. What if he wasn't talking to me? What if he was talking about me? Like I was part of something he was observing, tracking, analyzing, not in a personal way, in a structural way, like a system, and I just happened to be one of the inputs. That thought didn't feel dramatic. It felt simple, like it explained everything without explaining anything, because it didn't tell me how or why, just what. So I deleted the note, immediately, not because I thought it would change anything, but because I didn't want it there, didn't want to keep looking at it. And after that, nothing else happened. No messages, no sightings, no strange patterns, just normal life. It's been a few months now, and I haven't seen him again. Anywhere, which should feel like closure, and in a way it does, but every now and then I notice small things, not like before, nothing concrete, just moments, where I catch myself thinking, is this part of something? Of course, nothing happens, everything stays normal, because that's how it's supposed to be, but that thought. That slight pause, that's the part that stayed, not the situation itself, just the awareness of it, because whatever that was, it didn't feel random, it felt structured. Like something that continues whether you see it or not, and maybe that's the point, not to understand it, not to solve it, just to recognize it, and decide whether you want to be part of it or not, because sometimes stepping out is the only control you have. All right, that's the last one for now. Different stories. Different situations, but all with that same underlying feeling, something slightly off. Something that doesn't fully explain itself. If you made it this far, you're probably either deep into your gameplay or already half asleep. Either way, just let it play out, let your mind drift a bit. And if anything from these stories sticks with you, don't overthink it too much. Sometimes it's better not to. See you in the next one.